Hello and welcome to the Cross the Bear podcast in conjunction with Free Thinking Ministries. I'm Phil Bair, your host, and you'll notice that my name is Ming the Merciless here. Somebody gave me that moniker a few weeks ago because they think that I look like Ming the Merciless from Flash Gordon. So I'm going to use that moniker just for fun, and but I'm actually Phil Bair. I'm not really Ming, and I'm not really merciless. Well, I'm merciless with some Calvinists maybe, but I'm not merciless with them personally. I'm merciless with their ideology. So thanks for joining us, and we're glad that you're here. If you have any questions or comments, be sure and put them in the chat. And please subscribe to this channel. And I also want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel of my guest that I'm going to be bringing on. And my guest is the same guest that I had in part one of this series, and that's Dale Glover. So, hello, Dale. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I just got off a 5 hour podcast with debating an atheist on the historical evidence for the resurrection, but it wasn't the typical debate. It was more, does the Bible, the Christian Bible, support evidentialism as the standard, or does it just support blind faith? So yeah,
Yeah.
some nuance there.
Yeah, that's a great topic. Yeah. So, can we see you, or is your camera non-functioning at the moment?
Yeah, I'm on a different computer. I've had issues all day, so I'm on a different computer. There's no camera or anything like that.
Okay. Well, we miss seeing you, but we understand, and I don't know who "we" is when I say that. Like,
Yeah,
so,
I don't even have my pictures of Jerusalem to put up on this thing. So
oh, okay, gotcha. Well, I like your picture of Jerusalem. Like, it kind of makes me feel like you're just frozen in time in Jerusalem. That you're just always there. You're ever present in Jerusalem, and it's kind of a comforting thought for me. So,
yeah, yeah. Well, you'll have to do without it this time, but next time I promise.
yep. Okay, sounds good. I'll hold you to that promise. Well, I don't remember how long ago it was, maybe a week and a half ago, that you and I did our podcast on open theism, and the open theists that are friends of mine, Warren McGrew being the main one, they posted a response to our first video, and Warren McGrew is an open theist, and I just want to say a couple things at the outset, and that is that I I consider Warren a great friend. I have tons of admiration and respect for Warren. I believe in what he's doing as far as the other theological principles are concerned, besides open theism. And he's had me on his show several times when we've been talking about my book, Calvin's Desperation, and so on. So Warren he's a warrior against determinism. And that's something that open theists and Molinists like myself have in common. And that is that we both reject determinism and we both actually do battle against determinism in the strongest terms. And so we are brothers in arms when it comes to anti determinism. But we do have this divergence in our theology when it comes to open theism. I am a classical theist and Warren is an open theist. And so we will have that pushback against each other in that sense, but I don't want anyone to construe that as thinking that Warren and I are not great friends, that we don't love each other and respect each other. We actually do. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was that at near the end of Warren's conversation with Chris Fisher, where they were responding to our video, Warren said, "I hope that I have been charitable and I hope that I haven't been nasty or rude or anything like that." And so, not long after that broadcast, I texted Warren and I told him that I don't think he could have been more charitable if he tried. I thought he was unbelievably charitable and respectful and kind, and he was concerned that he might have misrepresented me and us and you, Dale, And that concern is consistent with what I know about Warren, that he's a humble guy, that he is a truth seeker, and that he doesn't want to misrepresent anybody because he knows that that's counterproductive, and he knows that doesn't actually contribute to to friendships and friendly conversation and friendly interaction and everything. So I want to shout out to Warren. I bravo for how charitable you were and how thoughtful you were about that presentation. And so I wanted to just get that out of the way right up front, because I don't want anyone to think that we are enemies. We simply disagree on this point of theology, but we are certainly not enemies, and we're brothers in Christ, and we both consider each other that. So, so Dale, what are do you have some kind of some opening thoughts about this conversation that that Warren had with Chris Fisher?
I think I concur with what you are saying there and stuff like that. I mean, I don't even know why he was where he didn't sound offensive or being gratuitously insulting or anything like that at all. I
Yeah,
thought he was raising substantive points in response to our video and stuff. So I was kind of just grateful that he gave us the time of day to kind of respond to our points. Now, I
hmm,
do think he did misrepresent us at times, but not on purpose. He
right,
was doing his best, right? Just like me and you,
right.
we're going to be doing our best to represent them and stuff like that. So, yeah, I had no issues with that show at all. So, yeah, great job, Warren and Chris. Thank you guys so much for doing it, and I hope.
Right.
Actually, I kind of agree most of their points against you on the presentism because I am an a theory of time proponent.
Hmm.
So yeah, those are my general thoughts there. And I have
Well,
about 4 points that in detail that I wanted to get into as we go throughout this.
well, we'll see if we can do something about that presentism commitment that you have. I'll see if I can. I'll see if I can reform you on that. So don't take that as being nasty. So what I wanted to do was I want what I want to do. I actually wrote a paper about open theism and dynamic omniscience, and we'll talk about what that means for those of you who might not know, might not be familiar with it. And that paper is entitled, I'm going to go pull it up, entitled The Death of Dynamic Omniscience and Open Theism, a Philosophical, Theological, and Biblical Autopsy. And this paper is 6,500 words, and so it's rather lengthy, but I wanted it to be thorough, and I wanted it to accurately represent open theism, and then I wanted to represent my my points against open theism and how I think that it's a false theology and a false ideology. And so I want to hear what you have to say. I think you have some notes there, Dale, and I definitely want to have you share those notes. But before we do that, what I want to do is if everybody will indulge me, I would like to read the introduction to this paper that I wrote. And I just finished it a few, I don't know, I don't remember when I finished it. But what got me started in in this whole issue was last fall I was asked to speak at a church in Denver, which is I live in Colorado and I'm up in the mountains in Evergreen, and I was asked to speak at a church in Denver called Agape Christian or see Agape Kingdom Fellowship, or I think that's what it is. A Agape Kingdom. I think it's Agape Kingdom Fellowship. I could look that up, and I may be wrong about that. But the pastor of that church is a guy named Will Duffy, and so he asked me to come speak at their church, and I believe that that church is populated with mostly open theists. So I think we could fairly call it an open theist church because Will Duffy's an open theist, and a lot of the people who attend there are also open theists. And but they asked me to come and speak and share my thoughts on open theism from the perspective of a classical theist, which is what I am. And I laid out my biblical case against open theism and dynamic omniscience and so on. And at the end of that presentation, Will Duffy got up and he addressed the crowd that we had there, and he said, "Folks, I got to tell you, this is the best presentation of on open theism that I have ever heard coming from a classical theist." And the reason I share that is not because I want to toot my own horn and not because of ego or anything like that. The reason I'm saying that is because I think that that was an indicator that I am not misrepresenting or misunderstanding open theism, because I think if I was, I think Will would have been able to simply pop up and immediately tell me, "Well, Phil, that was a good presentation, but I don't think you understand open theism accurately, and so let me give you some corrections about what open theism really is." He didn't do that. He actually confirmed that I do have a an accurate working understanding of what open theism is and what its implications are. So when when Warren and Chris gave their presentation, they objected to one of the terms that I used, which was that God is a time-bound being, and they didn't seem to be very comfortable with the phrase time-bound, and so that's okay with me. That's fine. I can throw that terminology away if it's not helpful and if it has connotations that don't seem to be very accurate. But I would use the term time situated or time oriented in reference to God, because the open theist denies that God exists outside of time. And as a classical theist, I affirm that God does exist outside of time, that he transcends time, and that time is actually his creation. And so, therefore, time is finite and it had a beginning, and God does not dwell within the scope of time. He is outside the scope of time. And so that's why I use the phrase time-bound being. Now, if anybody doesn't like that term, I'm perfectly fine with that. I won't use that. And I think that whenever I use it in my paper, I think I changed it to say time situated or time oriented or something like that. So I think that's a good representation, but I want to share this introduction to this paper because it kind of summarizes the content of the paper to a certain degree, and it's a good way to actually articulate what open theism is and my understanding of it and my objections to it in a way that's a lot more organized and a lot more concise than me just simply talking about it off the top of my head.
Could
So,
I, could I just very quickly add something? That in terms of the description, I think the perfect way to say it is God is temporal. He's got temporal dimensions. He's temporally located and temporally extended. And yeah, I think they'd be good with that.
yeah, well, and that's true, but if we say God is temporal or temporally located, that doesn't necessarily preclude the idea that he also transcends time, that God is both temporally located and temporally transcendent. And so that's a great way to put it, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands, because I affirm that God is temporally located. I affirm that God is a temporal being, But the reason that I affirm that is because God has the ability in his omnipotence to actually operate and function and relate to human beings within the scope of time. So I don't deny that. So if we just say that God is a temporal being, that doesn't really distinguish either one of our positions, because both of us affirm that God is a temporal being because he chooses to be. And on open theism, he's a temporal being because he has no choice, because that's his essential nature. He's a temporal being. So I don't know if that clarification helps or not, but
Yeah, fair. Yeah, fair enough. So I was mistaken. I thought Warren was kind of slightly strawmanning you by saying when you mentioned time bound, you had more to it, but it looks like you do. So okay, fair enough. I was mistaken there.
yeah, I'm not really sure what the reason that Warren had an objection to that phrase was. And but apparently there are some connotations to the term time bound that the open theist and Warren in particular doesn't like. And again, I don't mind. C.S. Lewis said, if you find some some terminology unhelpful, then drop it. And so I like that approach. So let me go ahead and read this introduction, because I think it'll be helpful in trying to frame this conversation. And I really should have read it when we first did our first video, but I didn't have the presence of mind to do that. But I think it's going to be helpful. I think it's going to be a little bit more articulate than what I am just going to say off the top of my head. So if you'll indulge me, I want to go through this introduction.
Sounds good.
I consider open theists good friends, brothers, and sincere disciples of Christ. My admiration for them is not trivial. I stand with them on a great many issues and theological principles. But there is a rhetorical seduction embedded in their advocacy for dynamic omniscience, a term which, at first glance, promises theological sophistication, relational richness, and philosophical depth. They adorn this position with Greek etymology, appeals to presentist metaphysics, and stylize its rejection of classical theism as a recovery of a more biblical and relational deity. But beneath their gilded veneer lies profound epistemic poverty. The God of open theism, the God the open theist describes, is not omniscient in any meaningful sense. He is epistemically limited, metaphysically mutable, and cognitively subordinate to the very creation he is said to sovereignly govern. The open theist God does not know the future, he forecasts it. He does not declare the end from the beginning, he deduces it. He does not speak because he knows all things. He speaks based on calculated probabilistic assessments conditioned by the character and intentions of finite creatures. This is not omniscience. It is strategic inference masquerading as divine knowledge. The open theist's entire framework hinges on the idea that God's knowledge is dynamic because the future is ontologically open. Future tense propositions in this system are not yet true and therefore cannot be known. What God knows are present facts, creaturely intentions, habits, tendencies, and from these he extrapolates what is likely to occur. This is not the God of Scripture. This is not foreknowledge. This is exalted estimation. To dress this up with theological language is to decorate a paper idol. One may speak of dynamis and presentist ontology, but the moment one insists that God cannot know what will happen until it does, the doctrine of omniscience has been gutted and hollowed. The open theist God is a sophisticated weatherman, excellent at pattern recognition, keenly observant, and almost always right. But almost always right is the epistemic threshold of fallible creatures, not the benchmark of a maximally great being. Knowledge, by any meaningful definition, entails the possession of justified true belief. But on the open theist model, there are no truths about future contingents. Propositions like Judas will betray Jesus or Bob will repent at age 50 have no truth value until they occur. Therefore, they cannot be believed by God and certainly not known. All God can do is forecast, an act of inference, not cognition. What this reduces to is a form of subcognitive projection. The deity of dynamic omniscience is epistemically suspended in a permanent state of predictive tension, waiting for reality to confirm or falsify his best estimates. This is a tragic diminution of divine majesty. Omniscience collapses into omniperspicacity. God becomes the ultimate psychologist, not the sovereign lord of time and history. To recover from its theological disasters, the open theist engages in rhetorical alchemy. He attempts to retain a vision of divine greatness by redefining it in relational terms. God is maximally great, he argues, because he is maximally responsive, maximally relational, maximally loving. But this is merely the language of compensation. He inflates God's emotional engagement precisely because he has deflated God's epistemic perfection. But the God who waits to find out what his creatures will freely do is not maximally great. He is temporally bound, cognitively contingent, and metaphysically dependent on that which is outside of himself. A God who does not know whether Nineveh will repent is not the God Jonah fled. A God who does not know if Peter will deny him is not the God who spoke in advance with perfect precision. Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. This is not relational dynamism, it is theological subversion. And then I just want to cover 2 more paragraphs about dynamic omniscience. At the center of open theism is the assertion that God does not know the future libertarian actions because actions are not yet actual and therefore not yet truth apt. This is a metaphysical move, not merely a theological one. The open theist commits to a form of presentism. Only the present exists, and thus only present tense propositions are properly grounded in reality. All propositions about future free decisions are indeterminate and hence unknowable. Thus, open theists do not deny omniscience by their own definition, they redefine it. God is omniscient in that he knows all that can be known, but not what cannot be known. On this view, the impossibility of foreknowing libertarian choices is not a limit on God, but on logic. As Clark Pinnock puts it, God knows everything it is possible to know, but free decisions are not possible to know ahead of time. Greg Boyd likewise asserts the future is partly settled and partly open. God knows it as such. But this formulation is a shell game. To say that God does not know X, not due to any deficit in himself, but due to a metaphysical fact about the nature of X, is to say that he lacks access to truths. It is no longer a matter of relationality, but of ignorance. Metaphysically necessary ignorance, perhaps, but ignorance nonetheless. This results in a theological model in which God is epistemically dependent on unfolding time. His knowledge grows as the future becomes present. He learns, he discovers, he adjusts, he revises. This is not omniscience, it is sanctified reaction. So that's the opening paragraphs of this paper that I wrote. And so you can give me a little bit of feedback on that and tell me what you think of it, and then we can start to cover some of the points that were made in our video, and then also in the video that Warren and Chris actually live streamed. So
Yeah, so give my opening. You're saying, like, my points. You're saying.
well, you can address the opening paragraphs of my paper, or you can just address your points, or do both, whatever you prefer.
Okay. So yeah. So first of all, just want to. So hey, Jack and Angel Brother and Hudson. So today's topic, if you're on my channel, it's a bit out of order because I didn't post up. Me and Phil did an original show on the topic of open theism and why we think that's false. So we're both Molinists, and the Idol Killer, Warren McGrew and Chris Fisher did a response to that video. So this is the third video in the series. Me and Phil are kind of responding to Warren McGrew's take on our original video. So that's the topic for today. And yes, Angel Brother, I am the man. Uh, so with that said, I'll get straight into. So in terms of the substantive points, yeah, I had about 4 points that I got from Warren, which kind of are consistent with what Phil is saying and kind of not. So here's one thing where I think Phil is totally wrong. And I did confirm this, right? So it's this issue of what is presentism or the A theory of time. And Warren and them confirmed that, yeah, it's what I learned in the philosophy of time, the secular philosophy, they are synonymous, right? So it just entails that only the present exists. The past does not ontologically exist. It's gone. The future does not ontologically exist. It's yet to be. But that doesn't mean that they lack a grounding for it, because with respect to the future, God can at least know some future tense facts on a probabilistic basis based on the evidence that exists in the present. And I would also say, so Phil, it's the same with the past. Only, yeah, God has 100% knowledge based on his memory that exists in the present, or any evidence that exists in the present. So that was something that I think they're right on, assuming the A theory of time is correct. Something that Phil is absolutely correct on, and they are wrong about, that perhaps we'll get to in the discussion, is with respect to the biblical data. I think Phil mentions our arguments about prophecies and all that stuff, but there is proof, I would say, with respect to God's eternality. I think there's Bible verses that support him being temporal, but there's also support for God being timeless. Jude chapter
Right.
25 suggests he's created before time. And, that's not logically prior to time kind of thing, right? So that's another thing I think Warren and Chris totally got wrong. The third point that I think we should get into is with respect to God's sovereignty, and God being this maximally great being. Is it really maximally great to be an open theist, or to be a God that doesn't know with 100% knowledge all the future things? Well, in that case, how could salvation history be guaranteed in a way? How do we know that God is a maximally great being? Maybe if Jesus was sacrificed in a pink tutu, in that world, more free will souls could have been saved versus this one where he was crucified, or maybe a world where Jesus was crucified in the year 35 AD instead of 30 AD. More souls, free will souls, would have chosen to be saved. So there's no. Oh no, am I still there?
Yep.
Yep.
You're still here.
There's no guarantee on open theism that God is a maximum great being, and that this is the best of all possible worlds where the maximum number of free will creatures get saved. So I think that's a huge problem with open theism. And then the fourth and final thing had to do with, I think, their criticism of me based on knowledge. So Chris said that I was presupposing a certain definition of knowledge. And it's not a justified true belief, but for me, it's a warranted true belief. That's my definition. But I would just say,
Plantiga.
Alvin Plantinga, yep, I think
Yeah.
he's got it. But and I think Chris, he would more go for this, knowledge as being basic in itself. So this knowledge first epistemology, rather than knowledge being made up of certain components, including propositions. But I'm going to be totally countering that. I think that my definition of knowledge is warranted, but regardless of the definition, I think that's kind of irrelevant to the point. That the point is there is knowledge of these future contingents, however you define it. And open theism does not have a God that would know the truth value of those propositions. So however you define knowledge, the point is God lacks it. So those are my 4 points there.
Yeah, I noticed that Chris Fisher took this big thick book on epistemology and he held it up to the camera, and I think his point was that epistemology is a rather deep and complicated subject, and so whether or not God has knowledge is going to partly be shaped by all the considerations that supposedly were written in this book. And and the question that I had when he did that, the question I had to myself was, so is this a book of human epistemology or is it a book of divine epistemology? In other words, does everything that is said about knowledge in this book apply to God, or does it just apply to contingent beings? Because I can pretty much guarantee you that knowledge for human beings has some things in common with God's knowledge, but there are a lot of things that it does not have in common, that there are a lot of differences between God's knowledge. And this is borne out by Scripture. The Scripture says that His ways are higher than our ways, and that His I I think it's a reference to that His knowledge is higher than our knowledge, His wisdom is higher than our wisdom, and so on. So I'm not sure how productive it is to hold up a book on epistemology in front of the camera for a video like that, because I, I I would like to know whether or not there is content in that book that speaks of God's epistemology and speaks of how God knows. And so it just didn't seem to be very productive for me, to be real honest with you. So, and what do you have any comments about that, Dale?
I do, yeah. I in your view, then, when you say God's knowledge is higher, I would agree with that in the sense that, yeah, God, look, God has complete, exhaustive knowledge in the sense that He knows all true propositions and stuff like that. He also has experiential knowledge. He doesn't have all experiential knowledge. That would be logically contradictory and impossible. But when you say higher, it almost sounded like you were saying like it's a different thing. Like for me, I would say no, it's the same. Like when God has propositional knowledge, it's a warranted true belief on His part, and He holds all of His beliefs in warranted true beliefs in the 100% degree. Whereas we as humans, we have warranted true beliefs, some of higher degrees, others lower degrees, but the knowledge itself is the same thing in terms of what it is. Are you saying you think God's knowledge is different? Like it's not a warranted true belief, or
Well, no, I don't think it's a warranted true belief, because I don't subscribe to the theory of warranted true belief. So I don't subscribe to Alvin Plantinga's model of warranted true belief. I subscribe to the classical view of knowledge, which is justified true belief. And justified true belief and warranted true belief are not the same thing. And the other aspect of that is that I think that, like I said before, I tried to make this clear, and maybe I wasn't very clear on it, but there are things in common between knowledge for God and knowledge for human beings. We're made in God's image, and so we are capable of knowing. And Jesus actually underscores that when He says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And so God knows, and we know. We both have knowledge, and there are certain fundamental properties of knowledge that I think that are shared between God and man. But I think for God, knowledge is more than what it is for man. And if you want me to be more specific, I would say that for God, knowledge is intrinsic to His nature. But knowledge is not in our knowledge is not intrinsic to our nature, because we're contingent beings. So our knowledge is contingent, and our knowledge is deduced. And so we gain knowledge through rational processes. God does not gain knowledge through rational processes. For us, knowledge is discursive. For us, knowledge is derivative. But for God, knowledge is not derivative, it's not discursive. It is simply a part of His ontological being. And so His knowledge is not contingent, because in classical theism, if an attribute of God is contingent, then that makes God Himself contingent. And there's lots of elaborate arguments that try to show that that's true. So for God, knowledge is immediate and intrinsic, and for us, knowledge is not immediate. It is inferential, and it is derivative. It's reactive awareness for us. It is not reactive awareness for God. God simply knows, period. And how He knows that, I think we would say that it's grounded in His nature. And we're going to have a hard time explaining that in any exhaustive way. But I think that that's something that we can specify as a fundamental difference between God's knowledge and our knowledge. So tell me if that scratches where you itch.
it does. Yeah, I for the most part, I'm totally on board with what you're saying. Look, God, all of God's knowledge is properly basic. It's immediate in that way. Whereas for human beings, we have some knowledge that's properly basic. That I know 1 + 1 = 2 in exactly the same way God does, in the 100% degree as well. But there are other times where our knowledge is not. We need to infer it on the basis of derivative knowledge, and God doesn't have that. So I'm totally on board with what you're saying. Thanks for clarifying that.
Okay. And then Hudson says, what do you mean by transcending time? What can God do in your view, Phil, by transcending time that the open theist God can't do, being what you have called, the lack of a better word, time bound? So that's a great question, and I this will actually this will help us clarify things. When I say that God transcends time, what I mean is that God is outside of time, that God is not only located in time and does not only function within the scope of time, that God ontologically exists outside the scope of time. The time is his creation. Time is a part of the created order and is not intrinsic to his own nature. So he created time, and if God created time, then he must have existed. He must have metaphysical existence prior to time and outside of time. And therefore, if if time is God's creation, then time had a beginning because God's creation is not eternal. Only God is eternal. He's the infinite personal God, according to Francis Schaeffer's terminology, which I love. Francis Schaeffer is one of my heroes. So so that's what I mean by transcending time. I hope that's helpful, and you can think of it as the fact that if I have a bucket of water and I take a sponge and I submerge that sponge in the bucket of water, the water will saturate that sponge. So the water is inside the sponge, but the water is also outside the sponge simultaneously. And so to me, that's a good way of putting it, that God is a temporal being in the sense that he can be inside of time and that he does locate himself in time, that he can experience time, and so therefore he can be a temporal being in that sense. But he is not limited to being a temporal being. He's also an eternal being, and he's also outside of time. And both of those can be true without any contradiction between the two. So when he says, what can God do in your view, Phil, by transcending time that the open theist God can't do? And the answer to that is that what God can do in transcending time is that he can view or see, so to speak, all of history in a single moment. In other words, he sees the past, he sees all of the events that have occurred in history, he sees the crucifixion, he sees the resurrection. He can view that all those events in time, but he can also view all of the events that have not occurred yet in the future. So he can view if somebody is going to have a child, if somebody's pregnant, he can view that child, that entire child's life, and he can see every event that occurs in the child's life that has not been born yet. And I think that's what the psalmist is talking about when he says that all my days are written in your book. In other words, he sees my entire life before me, even though my entire life is not finished yet. And so God sees all of time equally. Now, that doesn't mean that everything in time is equally happening. And that's a huge fallacy that I think a lot of open theists commit, because they say, well, Phil, if God transcends time, if he exists outside of time, and he can see all of time in a single moment, and he can view any event that he chooses, then that means that all of these things are real to God, and that to God, Jesus is still hanging on the cross. Jesus is still suffering, and every rape that occurred in human history is still occurring and is occurring right now, and God is God is experiencing that, that terrible tragedy. God is experiencing the suffering of Christ on the cross. God is experiencing the resurrection. And that is a huge fallacy. God is not experiencing time simply because he can view time. So the fact that God is aware of something doesn't mean that it is all equally real in a contradictory sense, because God can experience the fact that Jesus was dead after the cross and before the resurrection. But that doesn't mean that God can view the fact that Jesus was dead between the cross and the resurrection, but that doesn't mean that it is equally real to him, just as the fact that he is now alive and now sitting at the right hand of the Father. So we need to avoid this fundamental fallacy of thinking that simply because God is able to view all of the events in history at once, or basically at his choosing, doesn't mean that it is that they are all equally real. It doesn't mean that everything is folded into uh, into what's the word I'm looking for? Something is folded into something that is like all occurring at once. What's the word I'm looking for, Dale? I do this all the time.
Like a single into one single eternal moment or something. I don't know if that's probably
Yeah.
not. Yeah. While you're
Uh,
look, oh, go ahead. While you're looking that up, I do see we got some good questions. One, Hudson was asking, "Do you guys believe in absolute divine simplicity?" I'll just say for me, nope. I deny the classical doctrines of divine simplicity, divine immutability, and divine impassibility.
okay. The word I was looking for was spontaneity. That the fact that God sees all of history does not mean that he folds the timeline into simultaneity. Simultaneity.
Okay.
In other
Okay.
words, in other words, that he's folding it all into that this is all occurring simultaneously,
Yeah.
and
Like
that
Alexander
that's
Thomas' view, right? Eternal simultaneity thing. That I think that's what you're going for. Yeah.
yeah, and that's one of the objections to classical theism from the open theist tribe, because they say, well, if God sees everything all at once, that means that we have this eternal simultaneity and that everything is happening simultaneously, and God is experiencing and believing that all of these contradictory things are true when they were true at some point in the timeline but not true at other points in the timeline. And that there's simply no reason why we should accept this kind of simultaneity, just because God transcends time is just because he can view all of the events of history all at once. And when I say all at once, I'm talking about a logical moment. I'm talking about metaphysically. He is aware of all these things all at once, and he can point to various points in the timeline and say, at this point in history, this occurred. At this point in history, this occurred. At this point in history, Jesus was dead. At this point in history, Jesus was alive. And it doesn't mean that all these things are true at the same time. It just means that God knows when they were true and when they were not true and when they changed from one state to another. So I hope that answers the question. And Hudson can tell me if I did a good job of explaining that. But so where you and I diverge, Dale,
Mhm.
is that I am a classical theist. I do believe in divine simplicity, and I do believe that simply because, and divine aseity. Now, simply because God has multiple attributes that we can differentiate between, that doesn't mean that God's nature is multifaceted, or that God is composed of various parts. God is not composed of parts. The attributes of God are not the parts of God. The attributes of God are simply things that are true of God, but that doesn't mean that he is made up of those things. So that's why I say that God's that I that's why I affirm divine simplicity and divine aseity. He doesn't depend on anything else for his existence. He is whole and complete in and of himself. And
I affirm divine aseity as well. So yeah, I do affirm
okay,
that.
okay, all right, great. Well, and what I want to do is I don't want to get involved in the chat just right yet because there's so many things that I want to talk about. And but if you've got another point in your notes that you want to bring up and discuss, Dale, then I want to give you that opportunity. I want this to be a back and forth. I don't want to just dominate the whole conversation. So
Yeah, no problem. A lot, like I said, though, I think I mentioned the 4 points that really stuck out to me from what Warren and Chris were saying. So yeah, I'll let you kind of lead, but at some point I would like to get into some of those points and discuss those. So yeah, I'll let you lead, and when you're ready for me to bring in a point for discussion, just let me know, kind of thing.
okay, well, since we were talking about presentism and the idea of the fact that or the idea that the future does not exist, the past does not exist, only the present exists. We can talk about that because I have a section in my paper where I talk about presentism. And but before I do that, I want to talk about this idea a little bit more of this idea of God transcending time. Because one of the fundamental ideas of open theism is that God does not transcend time. That God is located in time and he is a temporal being only. So earlier we said that God is a temporal being, and both of us agree. We all agree that God is a temporal being because we agree that God can function inside of time. But in open theism, God is a temporal only being. He does not exist outside of time. And if that's the case, then time has to be eternal, co-eternal with God. And one of the questions that I would ask the open theist is, do you believe that God is an eternal being? And my guess is that most open theists would agree that God is an eternal being. He is a timeless being. And as soon as you say that he is an eternal being and he is a timeless being, then suddenly that runs into problems if the open theist also wants to say that God does not transcend time. So he's not timeless if he does not transcend time, if he is only a temporal being. And but yet I think if you press the open theist on this point, I think what the open theist would say is, yeah, I have to agree that God is an eternal being, because if God is not an eternal being, then he must be a contingent being. And I don't see that non-eternality and his divine necessity as being compatible with one another. I think we all have to assume and affirm that God is an eternal being. And would you agree with that, Dale?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's undeniable, even for open theists, that God is eternal. Now, where I think Warren is correct is he differentiates, and you're incorrect, is that Warren says eternal does not necessarily entail timeless. Necessarily, there are two modes of eternality. You could either be eternally timeless or eternally temporal, right? And on this front, I would agree. I would agree because I take Dr. William Lane Craig's view that I think God has been in both modes. Right. So he right now he's eternally temporal into the future and that sort of thing. But without creation, he was eternally timeless. And I that's where I kind of agree with you. I remember in our first show we were talking about how it doesn't make sense to think of God eternally temporal in the past, in the infinite past, because actual infinites just can't exist. They're logical absurdities. there can only be at best potential infinite. So it makes sense to say God is eternally temporal into the future as a potentially infinite series of one temporal moment after another. It doesn't make sense to say that about the past. And so you are necessitated to say that, well, God is either he's either eternally timeless and just never becomes temporal, as you and or both, as you say, Phil, or the William Lane Craig view. He was eternally timeless without creation, and then with creation, he's now eternally temporal into the future as a potential infinite. So,
Okay.
um,
Well,
yeah,
I see that as a profound contradiction because if God is timeless prior to creation, where the only thing that exists is God, if he is timeless prior to creation, then he is timeless by nature. And if he's timeless by nature, once he creates, then suddenly he becomes a time situated or a temporal being. And what that means is that his nature actually changed when he created the universe. And I can't. I simply would call anybody. I would say that anybody who thinks that God's nature changed when creation occurred, I think they're dead wrong about that. God's nature does not change. And if God's nature changes because of that he suddenly created the created world, then God is a contingent being because his nature can be affected by something other than himself. And so I see that as actually logically absurd to say that God used to be timeless, but now he's not timeless anymore. And and so you can give me your thoughts on that.
yeah. That so this is a good point, and on the face of it, it does seem like it's a contradiction in terms, but it's not, right. So here's where the problem is coming in. Again, it's based on your classical assumptions that God is immutable in the absolute sense, whereas I would say, well, says who? No, there can be certain lateral contingent changes, such as in the mode of his eternality, and that's not a diminishment. He values God or says, "Oh, he's better now." It's a lateral change, and that's totally fine. So there are contingent aspects, but that doesn't mean God is contingent in his existence. No, he's a necessary being. He exists out of the necessity of his own internal nature, and he exists, I say, and all that. So I think you're kind of making a mistake when you say that God must be immutable in every single aspect. Otherwise, that's a problem. And I would raise a couple points to try and prove that. Right. So the first is something you yourself said, right? Um, actually, okay, so I'm going to require some interaction. So the first argument is temporal knowledge. Like for example, your God, a timeless God, I know things that God can't. I know that today is May 5th, 31st, 2025. I don't think your God can know that, and I'll explain why in a second. Also, you
Okay.
mentioned that your not your God. Sorry, I didn't mean it that way, but I mean your understanding of God is that I didn't mean it
I
that
get
way.
it. I get it.
Uh,
No, don't worry about it. I get it.
Awesome. So you were saying, look, God does. He doesn't necessarily have all experiential knowledge of every temporal moment, despite the fact that he can observe all of time itself. But I would say that just by that, you've just admitted God is temporal, because even just observing, that's an experiential relation that's giving God experiential knowledge, and it's in temporal succession. If you're saying he doesn't have all of
Okay.
this in a single eternal simultaneity moment, then you're saying there isn't a succession, right? At one time, he's experiencing the fullness of the resurrection. At a later time, he's experiencing the fullness of that moment and just observing the resurrection in 30 AD. But
Yeah, that's not an accurate representation of my systematic.
okay, so here's what will clear it up then. So I admit my thing is kind of assuming something that you believe in the B theory of time. So take God out of it. Forget God. Obviously, you believe creation is temporal. Time exists, right?
Hmm.
Okay. Now, what's the nature of that time? Is it a theory of time? Obviously, you deny that. The tense theory of time, tense isn't real. So you do believe in a B theory of time. It's
Not
tense.
necessarily.
Okay.
My theory of time has some things in common with the B theory of time, but I don't subscribe to the B theory of time in its totality.
Okay, so I would I guess before we can even look at God, yeah, like we would need to understand like what exactly is your view of creation? What is the temporal nature of creation? Because that's what I'm not understanding properly.
That God, that a timeless God created a world, a universe, whatever you want to call it, that he produced and created creation, and creation is made up of space, time, and matter, and that those three things have specific relationships with each other. Time does not exist without matter or without space. Space does not exist without time and matter. And matter does not exist without time and space. So those three things are absolutely coupled with each other. And I shouldn't say coupled because coupled implies two, and I'm talking about three things. But those three things are melded together. They are all interdependent as far as their existence is concerned. And so time had a beginning in my theory of time and my theory of creation, and that the beginning of time coincided with the beginning of space and the beginning of matter. And that space, time, and matter are the three main components metaphysically of creation. And that prior to creation, space did not exist, matter did not exist, and time did not exist. So God created those things when he created the creation. and and prior to creation, metaphysically prior to creation, there's no such thing as time, there's no such thing as matter, there's no such thing as space. All those things are part of contingent creation. And so I believe that time is a temporal category, that it does progress, it does move forward, that there is a playhead, so to speak, where time is moving from the future to the past constantly, and in a constant motion, constant forward progression. And so, therefore, we can have tensed propositions. Before, we can have after, we can have during, we can have now, we can have then. And so, if that's the case, then God has to exist outside of time eternally. And so his timeless nature speaks to the fact that that is who and what God is and was metaphysically prior to creation. And if that's the case, then time had a beginning, and I would deny that the possibility that time does not have a beginning, that time stretches back to an infinite past. And I can come up with the argument for the idea that time had a beginning, because I think there's both biblical support for it, and there's also philosophical and logical support for it. Because a time stretching back to an infinite past is logically absurd,
Yep.
and is self-defeating. And so that's why I wanted to go through this idea of time not being eternal, but God is eternal, and God is timeless, and time is not timeless. So when we say God is temporal, what I mean by that is that God can function in time, and he can relate to his creation in time, and he can share the reality of time with creation because he's omnipotent. If he couldn't do that, he wouldn't be omnipotent. But the fact that God can share the reality of time with creation doesn't mean that he is limited in within the scope of time, and that he doesn't also exist outside of time and above time, so that he can see all of history in his eternal awareness. So, so I think where we're having this misunderstanding is that the idea of that God being temporal, that is not a description of his nature. That's a description of his functionality, so to speak. In other words, what is God like, and how does God do things? Those are two separate questions. And the fact that God does things temporally does not change his nature as an atemporal eternal being. Does that help?
Uh, yeah. So let me start here. So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying against the open theist, right? I'm with you about it's the impossibility of an infinite temporal past, and therefore there must be some point where God is timeless, and or God just is timeless, period, or something like that. That's an aspect of God. That's a mode of God's eternality. So I'm with you about that, right? The open theists are totally wrong. I on that. Now, in terms of the functionality aspect, now this was something I thought about, because in our first show, I was disagreeing with you, and I was saying, look, what you're saying is just contradictory unless you're saying they're both true in different senses, and that's where you brought in, well, he's temporal in his functionality, but he's timeless ultimately in his nature, in his ontological, metaphysical nature. Now, I thought about that. I thought that was a decent answer, deserving of consideration. But as I thought about it, though, I do think that, look, if he's functionally temporal, then he is. That does entail that his ontological nature is experiencing temporal succession. Just because in order to function, that's a relation. That's a change in relation. So unless you're saying that God is, like timelessly, he's in this eternal simultaneity of functionality where he's experiencing these functional relations all at once from all periods of time. But that's something you denied when you said no, God doesn't experience this eternal simultaneity. So that's where I don't think your theory works. You can't appeal to functional stuff because you're appealing to a temporal succession of functional relations he's engaging in with creation. So actually, your God, not a pagan thing, but your understanding of God is temporal if you go for these functional successions.
Yeah, well, I would tweak that a little bit, and I would say that, and I don't want to get too hung up on this because there's a whole lot of things that we want to cover today, but I would say that God has awareness of the temporal nature of time, and that he can actually participate in the temporal reality of creation with his creatures, and so that he can share that metaphysical reality of temporal reality. In other words, he can share the metaphysical reality of time as a progression from past to future. And if he couldn't do that, then that would severely bruise his maximal greatness, and it would severely bruise his omnipotence. If God can't climb into time, so to speak, and I don't want to get too hung up on the implications of that metaphor, but if God can't climb into time, and he can't live in time with his creatures and have a relationship with his creatures that is that exists in a temporal reality, then God is not omnipotent. He cannot, and that is not logically impossible. And so, since it's not logically impossible for God to climb into time and to participate in time with his creatures in a relational aspect where he can be relational, he can be responsive, and he can have a personal relationship, and he can walk through our lives with us and be present with us. If he couldn't do that, and then he's not much of a God, not very impressive. But the fact that he can do that and does do that doesn't mean that he doesn't also transcend time and that he is not also a timeless being and has always been a timeless being. Because we can't say that God laterally changed his mode of existence, because that would imply that God is restricted in time. That implies that God is limited in his temporality. And he's not limited in his temporality. He's not limited in anything. So the fact that God can participate in time with his creation and share that reality with us personally, that doesn't mean that he is somehow changing his nature or that he's somehow changing his mode of existence. That's not what he's doing. And so that's where I think that's where they think the mistake occurs. Because if God changes his nature, then he's not a necessary ase being at that point. So I hope I'm making sense.
Uh, well, yeah, yeah, I get what you're trying to say and stuff, and yeah, I do disagree. Obviously, I do think that it has these kind of contradictory entailments. So yeah,
Okay.
but
Well, you haven't shown that, but I'm not saying that you can't. But I may be a good question to ask, and I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but just real quickly, maybe a good question to ask is, what is the argument that establishes the conclusion that God made, and I'm talking about past tense here, which just seems incoherent on its face, but what is the argument that supports the conclusion that God made some kind of lateral change in his nature at the time that he created creation? I mean, is there an argument that supports that, or is that just kind of a theory and just a general assertion in order to escape certain entailments of its denial? I mean,
yeah, so if I were, it would need to be a complex argument with sub arguments for sure. But I think where I would start is try to come up with certain arguments proving the A theory of time applies to creation. That tense is ontological, it's real. So that would be a first sub argument kind of thing, right? Then I would try and come up with an argument um, involving God into that God stands in certain relations to that tense temporal universe and has certain knowledge of that tense to temporal universe. And in that way, that would evidence that there is a temporal succession within God's ontological life and that sort of thing. So I think that's how I would construct the argument. I don't have like premises off the top of my head right here, but I could
okay,
think about that and construct it for you.
okay, that's fine. So, but let's move on to presentism, because the the idea of presentism, and it's not identical to the A theory of time, but they are closely related. The idea of presentism is that the present is the only thing that exists. That the future does not exist, the past does not exist. And and so if presentism is the only thing that exists, don't we have to say that the present is real?
Yes.
Okay. So the present is real, the past is not real. It used to be real because it used to be the present. And the future is not real because the future has yet to be for us, for contingent beings. Now, I deny that the future does not exist in the sense that God is aware of what occurs in the future, and therefore there is some kind of truth maker for the future actually existing. And I think you are on board with that, right,
Yeah,
Dale?
yeah,
Okay, okay,
yeah. Okay.
okay.
So you okay?
But during the conversation between Warren and Chris says time is not a thing.
Yeah,
Time is not something that has any kind of measurable quality to it. And what he's essentially saying, if I understand this correctly, and I could be misunderstanding what Chris said, and if I am, then I apologize, and I would like to have some clarification. But my sense when Chris said time is not a thing, what I'm hearing is time is not real. But has a commitment to the 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 idea, the concept of presentism, and yet in which case the present is the only thing that's real. Well, the present is still a temporal category, is it not? And doesn't the present move forward? And so the present moment is constantly moving into the future. And so the future moments are constantly becoming present moments. And then they're disappearing into the past and they're not real anymore. They don't exist anymore. But if Chris is going to hold to that kind of idea of presentism has to progress. It can't be static. It can't the present moment can't simply remain static and never move. The present moment still has to move forward. And so the present moment is still a temporal category, which affirms that time is real. If time is not real, then the present is not real. And so there's this massive contradiction between the idea that only the present is real, but time isn't real.
yeah.
Those things.
So yeah, I agree with you that I was kind of confused as to what he was saying. I don't think he's clear here. So like I see that there's two interpretations of what Chris was saying. There's the one that you say, in which case, yeah, I mean it's just hopelessly contradictory and is incoherent. Or if I'm trying to steelman him, maybe what he was trying to say was that there's a distinction between absolute time and then like the measures of time. So what is time? Or sorry, not measures of time. What is time? It's as Warren defined it. It's like change. It's succession. So it's the things changing is what time is. It's not like time is its own substance that exists in and of itself. That was the second way that I think he might have been meaning that like time's not, it doesn't exist in as though it's its own thing. It's just like change or things
Well,
changing.
he said that time cannot be measured,
Yeah, I didn't get
and
that.
he said the idea of measuring time to him is meaningless and incoherent. But I think that when Warren said that the definition of time is change,
Mhm.
I see that as equally incoherent because things change. They change over time. I change. So does that mean that I'm time? Am I time simply because I change? So I think this definition it lacks any kind of meaningful coherence. To say that time is simply change is I think is a category mistake because things change, contingent beings change, contingent objects change, contingent reference in the universe, they change. Planets change and stars change and various natural objects, biological life, all these things change, but that doesn't mean that those things are all time because the fact that they change requires time. It's not the definition of time. Things change within the scope of time and within the reality, the metaphysical reality of time, and time allows things to change because they change as they pass through the progression and the sequence of time. And so I just really can't get on board with this idea, this overly simplistic idea that time is just simply change. And maybe it's just change in a metaphysical or an abstract sense. But
Yeah.
again, I don't see how that can be a definition of time. I think that's something that time can can provide for us. Time can enable change to occur, but that doesn't mean that change is the definition of time. So uh, you can tell me what you think of that.
So I tend to agree with them. I hate. I'm sorry. I'm such a terrible partner. Like I keep. Uh, yeah. Like this is how William Lane Craig does it, right? And when I took my metaphysics course, even secular philosophers do think of it this absolute time this way, and I argued it goes back to Plato actually. This distinction between measuring time. I don't think Chris. No, of course we can measure time. I don't know what he means by that. But I do take the nature of absolute time to be this, ontologically speaking, what is it? It is this sequential change, fundamentally. It's not like time is its own substance. Like some philosophers say time is made up of these little individual temporal atoms known as chronon. So it's like they're a substance in themselves or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
do you think that what is time for you? Do you think it's like a substance that exists
Well,
or
no, man, that would be a category mistake. I think that we should avoid conflating time with matter. I think that would be a huge mistake.
good point?
Time and matter are not identical. Time is not matter, and matter is not time. So time is not made up of matter the way light is made up of photons, for example. So,
So what is time for you then? Like
pardon me.
like what is time then? If it's not change in this metaphysical sense, and it's not chronons or something like that, like do you have a notion as to what it is? Or
No,
okay, fair enough.
I think that human beings have an intuitive understanding of what time is in a very fundamental and abstract sense. But I don't think it's possible for human beings to define time. So I have no definition of time. All I can do is describe the properties of time. I think we can say that time progresses, that there is a forward momentum, there's a forward progression of time, that it's not static. It doesn't just simply sit there and doesn't move. I think it does move. There is a progression. There is a temporal category when we talk about time. And when we say time, that the present exists, we can say that the present is constantly moving forward. But how that happens and what the actual metaphysical nature of that is, I don't think we can define it. I don't think we can even understand it fully enough to the point where we could actually come up with some kind of definitive definition of time. So, so when you look up time in the dictionary, I think what you're getting is descriptions of time. And the main description of time is that it moves forward and that and that therefore it had to have a beginning. Anything that progresses had a beginning. Anything that progresses is not eternal, is not infinite, because whatever is infinite cannot progress. If it can progress, it can be added to, and you cannot add to infinity. Therefore, time is finite because it progresses. And that's an automatic. This is philosophy 101. I learned this the first day of my philosophy classes when I majored in philosophy at the University of Iowa. This is day one in class. Whatever is infinite does not progress. Because if something progresses, it's not infinite. If it's infinite, it doesn't progress. And if time progresses, then it logically follows necessarily that it is finite. If it is finite, it had a beginning. If it had a beginning, then it was created. Anything that had a beginning had to have been created. And so, therefore, if time had a beginning and it was therefore created, which is all logically necessary, it follows that God created time. The time is a part of creation. And if that's the case, it follows also that God is outside of time, so to speak, that he transcends time, and that he is a timeless being, and he sits above time and sits above history, and he sees all of history in one timeline, and he can identify what occurred at various times in history, and that there is an actual playhead. It is Sunday or Saturday, May 31st, 2025. That is today's date, and that is the playhead. It's 1:22 p.m. in my time in Colorado. And so there is a playhead. There is a current location in time, in history. And God knows where that playhead is, and he sees it progressing from the future to the past. But that doesn't mean that he is constrained by that playhead and by that scope of time. He exists outside of it and above it. And that is logically necessary because time cannot have had a begin, or time cannot be eternal. Time had to have had a beginning. And if it had a beginning, then God created it. If God created it, he is outside of it because God cannot be limited by his own creation. And that's why I say that God transcends time. If that's the case, then presentism is false because the future does exist because God is aware of the future. It just doesn't exist for us. It doesn't exist for us contingent beings because we are time bound beings. We're limited by time. We exist within the scope of time and we cannot escape the scope of time in our earthly life as contingent beings. And so, therefore, there is a playhead. We move through time. We all move through time together, and we can measure time, but it is all a finite creation of God. And therefore, God transcends it. God is outside of it because he cannot be limited by his own creation. All right, I've been rambling a lot here, so I'm going to let you talk.
Uh, well, yeah. Look, I agree that God was timeless without creation and that sort of thing. Now you mentioned this thing about progression and stuff. I'm wondering about. Well, there could be obviously William Lane Craig's view is that there is simultaneous causation, and that's how God's timeless and exists beginning at temporally at the beginning
Okay,
of the
can,
creation.
can I interrupt you real quick? I'm sorry. I apologize. I don't want to be rude, but I need to interrupt you for just a second. When you say time, the God was timeless before creation, as soon as we say God was, suddenly we have fallen into error. I don't think you can say God was because if he's a timeless being, there is no tense for anything related to God. God was not something. God simply is. And so if as soon as we say God was timeless before creation, what we're doing is we're automatically and not necessarily and without knowing it, we're automatically saying that God is intrinsically a temporal being sans creation, without creation. So God, you can't say God was something and God will be something because there is no time sequence with God. There's no tensed proposition when it comes to God. Now, we can say that there are tense propositions if we talk about God sharing the reality of time with us in creation. But that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is that God was timeless before creation, and that is incoherent because there is no time for a timeless being, and so there is no such thing as was.
Well, there is on my view because it was 14.8 billion years ago that or 6,000 years ago. You're a young universe creationist, so 6,000 years ago that.
Oh, I'm not committed to 6,000 years,
Oh,
but
okay.
I get your point. Yeah.
Yeah. So on my view, with the A theory of time and the fact that God's temporal, it does make sense. It's not illogical, and it just comes down to this moment of creation where God is both timeless and temporal because of this simultaneous relationship. The instant of creation is the instant time starts, and the instant God is temporal type thing, and then his temporal life begins at that thing, and then progresses, kind of thing, right? So, I guess it all comes down to this notion of simultaneity and simultaneous causation, which I think works, and William Lane Craig provides examples of this working in the real world. But that's the solution, because otherwise, you're totally right. It's just incoherent nonsense to say, well, temporally before 14.8 billion years ago, well, 14.9 billion years ago, God was timeless, and then 14.8, he became temporal. That's illogical, incoherent nonsense. So the only way out of
Right.
that is through this simultaneity causation answer.
Okay. Well, I think Scripture backs up the P theory of time because I think that Titus 1:2 specifically says that time had a beginning and that God did something, or God had, there was a reality in God that existed logically prior to the beginning of time. Now, the Greek word says before, but the word before in the Greek can have multiple meanings. It can mean before in a tensed proposition, or it can mean before as logically prior to or metaphysically prior to. And so it says before the beginning, before the ages of time. And and the open theist wants to call that, he wants to call that some kind of that God did this a long time ago. And so they remove the idea of the beginning of time from Titus chapter 1 verse 2. And and if that's the case, I don't see where the word before can be coherent in that story, because you can't have before the ages of time. All you can have is near the beginning of the ages of time or close to the early ages of time, but that's not what that verse says. The verse says before the ages of time. And there's a reason why the NIV scholars translated it before the beginning of time, because I think that's what Paul is actually saying. And we can know that also philosophically because you and I both agree that an infinite stretch of time back to the infinite past is logically impossible, logically absurd. And so the concept of the beginning of time is actually coherent. But I think where you and I diverge is that that God somehow changed his state changed the state of his existence. So whereas before he was a non-temporal being, whereas at the beginning of creation he suddenly became a temporal being and climbed inside of time and can never escape from it. Now he's stuck. He's committed. And that's William Lane Craig's view, is that when God created creation, then he became a temporal being at that point, and that speaks to a shift in God's nature. And I think a shift in God's nature is logically absurd. If God's nature changes, he is a contingent being, period. So,
Once you go temporal, you can never go back. But no,
yeah,
you were
I mean, that's basically what you're saying. It's basically what William Lane Craig is saying.
yeah,
Is that
yeah.
once you become temporal, and I just don't see how that can escape the fact that God's ontology changed. I don't think that his ontology ever changes. I don't think his nature, his essential nature, ever changes. I think that how he operates and how he functions and how he does things can change. But that's not a reference to his nature. That's simply a reference to his actions, to his doing things. So,
Well, I just, yeah, I don't think we need to assume that it's an essential feature of God in terms of the mode of eternality. It's, I think, it's a contingent one, and God has contingent properties that make lateral changes, so they don't make God better or worse. in any way. And I know that's arguable because you mentioned you think God's becoming temporal is worse or something like that, right? But um, so yeah, I would just argue there are certain lateral changes and they don't matter. Like God acquiring a human nature, that's a change, and it doesn't make him any better or worse, and stuff like that. But I I want to be I want to make you happy here, Phil, because I was finally going to say I totally agree with those open theists, those bad Warren McGrew. They're totally wrong. So I'm finally doing my duty here. But yeah, the Bible mentions, I think, both. I think it alludes to God's being in time, being temporal, or in your words, functioning within time, and also he's timeless. These verses, before
Exactly.
this is how they. I think in Revelation there's something too, like the eternity of eternities, or forever and ever, and stuff like that. That I don't know if I'm misremembering that, but there's some kind of verse that speaks of beyond eternity, God being beyond eternity, which I think alludes to his timelessness and stuff. So it's clear, yeah, we both fully agree. The Bible speaks of both of these modes of eternality and apply them to God. It's just how do we put them together? And I take the William Lane Craig approach, and you take the both and approach at this point, kind of thing. But we
Okay.
agree on the Bible.
Well, I want to shift gears real quick, and I want to talk about this idea that the future does not exist and the past does not exist. And my argument here is that if the future is unknowable because it does not exist, then by definition the past is also unknowable because it also does not exist. And but the Bible clearly states that God knows the past perfectly. But under the B theory of time, or sorry, the A theory, and under presentism, God cannot know the past any more than he cannot know the future. And so if the future not if the non-existence of the future means that God can't know it, then the non-existence of the past means that God can't know it also as well. And the pushback that I get from the open theists at that point is, well, God can know the past because of his memory or because of a historical record that he has access to, or that God can know the past because of evidence. I think that was one of the words that was used during that conversation, was that God can know the past because he has evidence that the past existed. And my reply to that is, you cannot do that. God's knowledge is not derivative. So if God knows the past because he remembers it and because he has a memory, then that means that God's knowledge is derivative. It's not intrinsic. It's not intrinsic awareness at that point. And if that's the case, then what we're doing is we're denying the nature of God and his ability, or his essence of immediate knowledge, that he does not access the way you access a computer, or the way that you access a memory bank. God has no memory. He simply has pure intrinsic knowledge, period. And so this derivative nature of God accessing the past through some kind of instrumentality like memory or evidence or something like that, that is that what that's saying is that God deduces the past from his memory, or from his from some kind of record that he has access to, or from some kind of evidence or something. Contingent beings acquire knowledge through evidence. They acquire knowledge through memory. They acquire knowledge through a record. And that is all, that is not intuitive knowledge. That's knowledge derived from something else. And I can't, if you, as soon as you say that God derives his knowledge from memory, or from something, that God's knowledge is derivative, now God is a contingent being. And I don't know how anyone could ever escape that conclusion. So God's knowledge can't be derivative. If that's the case, then the whole idea of presentism collapses. Because presentism says that God can't know the future because it doesn't exist, but it denies that God can't know the past because it also doesn't exist. And that's incoherent. The only way to rescue God's knowledge of the past that doesn't exist is through some kind of derivative knowledge, and God does not have derivative knowledge. He doesn't know things because he has evidence. He doesn't, like robot here says, he doesn't need evidence. He simply knows, period.
Interesting. Yeah, Mr. Robot. Yeah, welcome. He's from my channel there. So Phil, guess what? You are about to love me because I am going to apologize. I said that I agreed with them and that you were wrong on something. I think you might be right on this presentism thing, right? Because I would agree with you that, look, yeah, God isn't, his knowledge of the past is conceptual. It is this properly basic belief, as I would refer to it, proper with respect to warrant, or in your case, with respect to justification, however you define knowledge. But yeah, it is this what you're calling intuitive, this properly basic way. It's not derived from memory or evidence and stuff like that. But yeah, I would agree. So I agree with Warren and stuff that, look, the past and or the future doesn't need to ontologically exist in order for the God to have at least some knowledge of the future and or the past. And in God's case, because we would accept conceptual, properly basic beliefs, this intuitive knowledge conceptually, that's how he can have 100% knowledge of the future and 100% knowledge of the past. Now, I think what you're saying is the open theists would, because they want to deny this conceptual, intuitive, properly basic belief about the future, they would have to do the same about the past. In which case, okay, well, what's God? Are you saying God's using like a memory and stuff like that? I apologize. You have more of a point than I understood in the beginning, and I need to think about that as to whether God has a memory or uses it in any way, or I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So if God has a memory and he uses it and he draws from it, then that's a tool. God has a tool at his disposal. God doesn't have any tools. Everything in God is intuitive. Everything in God is essential to his nature. Everything in God is absolutely, what's the word I'm looking for? See, I'm constantly doing this, Dale, and I apologize that these words fall out of my mouth. But God's knowledge cannot be discursive, because if it is, then God is relying on something other than himself. And even if he relies on something within himself, it's still derived. It cannot be derived with God. It has to be part of his essential nature. His knowledge has got to be intuitive.
Can I just ask? Sorry, I interrupted you. I have a question after you're done.
No, go ahead. You can interrupt me. I interrupted you earlier, so
No,
it's
we're doing it to each
turnabout
other.
is fair play.
Okay, so this is just a clarification thing, because I don't have as much interaction with open theists and stuff. Like, obviously, you're a part of free thinking ministries, and you guys specialize in this stuff. I'm just curious, for the open theists, do they see the fact that for them, God can only know the past in derivative ways based on memory or inferring from evidence? Do they see that as a diminishment, or do they embrace that and say, yeah, that's how he does it? Who cares if it's derivative?
No, they don't. Yeah, they don't. I don't think they see a problem with it.
Okay.
I don't think they understand the problem with their systematic.
Mm.
I don't think they understand that if God's knowledge is derivative, then it's not essential. It's not intuitive. And if God has discursive knowledge, then God is going through a process in order to gain knowledge. And if God goes through a process in order to gain knowledge, then there are then God is a contingent being, because gaining knowledge from any kind of process or tool, any kind of derivative knowledge, that is what contingent beings do. That's what human beings do. That's how we discover knowledge. And the guys, Warren and Chris, at one point in their video said that God doesn't think under classical theism. And my reply to that is, well, God doesn't God may not think the way that we do, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't think at all. God's rationality is simply immediate. It is not discursive. It does not go through any kind of process. God thinks because he is rationality itself. And so it's simply faulty to say that under classical theism God doesn't think. All it means is that under classical theism God doesn't think the way that contingent beings do because he's not a contingent being. It doesn't mean he doesn't think. And there's nothing in classical theism that would lead anyone to believe that God cannot be relational, that he can't be responsive, that he can't be personal, and that he can't think. As far as the open theists are concerned, in classical theism, God is simply frozen. That he is just a frozen being. That he is not dynamic. He's not. And by the way, they deny that he's even personal, because a personal being requires some kind of interaction, requires some kind of temporality. And I would deny that. I would say personality does not require temporality, but for personal interaction to occur, then you may be able to function in time in order to interact in a personal way. That doesn't mean that God's nature is not a personal being. And so there are so many category mistakes that are being made on the open theist side. And it's kind of frustrating because they give us what they think are the open theist entailments, and they are not the entailments of open theism, or I'm sorry, classical theism. They're saying that these are the entailments of classical theism. God is frozen. God is a wax figure that no one can relate to, because God is so static that he can't move. He is completely paralyzed in this frozen state of existence that God has. That is not what classical theism says, and that is not an implication of classical theism. And to simply say that those are is begging the question. It's a huge batch of begging the question at that point. Are you still there? Did you go to sleep, Dale? Hello, Dale. Okay, we may have lost Dale. I don't know. I'm not hearing anything from him. Maybe I offended him. I don't know. Okay, Dale, are you there? Calling Dale Glover. Okay, I don't know what happened to Dale, but we can cover a little bit more ground, a few more points. Um, Let me take a comment. Hudson, so there is no being and becoming in God when it comes to the God world relation. Does God not have a contingent action of grace and judgment due to the present tense actions of mankind? I don't think that God has contingent actions. I'm not sure what that necessarily means, because God is not a contingent. There's Dale. Are you back? Are you back, Dale? Okay, I'm hearing some noise coming from Dale's channel, but I'm still not hearing him talk. Are you having some technical difficulties, Dale? Are you there, Dale?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was freezing up. I was hearing bits and pieces of what you were saying, but hopefully I'm
Oh,
back now.
darn it.
You
Okay.
can hear.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
I can hear you, but are you there?
yep. Okay, so yeah, so what I was going to say again, my computer's acting up a bit, so hopefully I don't go in and out again. But I thought you brought up a great point. Now that makes sense about the knowledge and the lack of conceptual propositional knowledge, and this is why Chris was kind of taking me to task about my understanding or definition of knowledge. And I would just want to come back about that. That look, this is there's obviously propositions exist, right? There are statements of fact that are either true or false, like about the past, the present, and or the future. We just know that these things exist in a properly basic way. Everybody kind of admits that. So I was kind of surprised that he was trying to downplay that. There aren't these propositions that exist. This is just philosophical mumbo jumbo and stuff like that. No, everyone knows that it's just common sense, including back in biblical days. That okay, yeah, there are certain statements of fact, and okay, it's either true or false. This reflects
Hmm.
a biblical worldview, and then okay, it's just a question. Well, are there such propositions that apply to the past? I think we would all say yes, and the present. I think we would all say yes. Well, then there's also propositions applying to the future, and they could either be true or false. So God would conceptually would have to know those in a properly basic way. So once we admit that there are propositions, if they're just denying that propositions themselves exist, then that's a very odd world. I just
Yeah,
can't.
well, and I don't know if they're denying that propositions exist. I think what they may be doing is they're denying that certain propositions can are knowable, and because of the fact that the future in which those propositions become true doesn't exist, and so therefore the propositions about the future are unknowable. And
Okay.
whether or not that means they don't exist, I don't know. I don't know how they would answer that.
So then here's the problem. If God can't know these certain propositions in the conceptual way that we are arguing for, then okay, those propositions can't exist because what grounds them? They're saying, like, obviously God has to ground all these propositions. I don't believe in some platonic world where abstract objects or propositions exist. Everything is grounded in something, in God, that he's the substance that exists, that grounds all propositions, statements, ideas, knowledge. It's all grounded, in this case, in the mind of God. So what would are open theists like Platonists? Do they think certain propositions are just floating around outside of God?
Well, I don't think they're Platonists because I think they think that I'm a Platonist, or they think I'm a Neoplatonist. So I don't think they are.
That's true.
And but I think you could define omniscience this way, that there is a set of propositions that are either true or false, and those propositions are about not only the past and the present, but also about the future. So let me give you an example. Phil will go to the grocery store tomorrow. That is a proposition. And if we accept bivalent logic, then we have to say that proposition is either true or false. Now, the way that I define omniscience is that God knows the truth values of all conceivable propositions.
Right.
If that's the case, then it is impossible for God to not know the future, because the future, there are propositions that are either true or false in the future. And the fact that they are in the future does not mean that God cannot know them, any more than the idea that they existed in the past does not mean that God cannot know them. And so that's why I reject presentism, because presentism says the future does not exist and therefore it's unknowable. Well, if that's true, then God is not omniscient based on our proper definition of omniscience, and that is that God knows the truth values of all conceivable propositions. So if that's the case, then I have no choice but to reject presentism, because presentism contradicts the fundamental definition of what omniscience is.
Well, I don't think. Remember, I'm a presentist, and it doesn't
I
say.
know.
I think God can have conceptual knowledge, even though presentism is true. So that I don't think those are contradictory. But yeah, the open theist. Here's the problem: without begging the question that God has this conceptual. Let's say that there are certain. They admit propositions exist, right? And they're saying there are certain propositions that are not grounded in the God's mind, because He doesn't know them. He can't know these. So then what are those propositions grounded in? They exist. How do you explain their existence? And I think they would fall apart at that point, right? Like it.
Yeah, well, but I think presentism falls apart along with it, because presentism says that the future is unknowable because it doesn't exist.
No, but it doesn't say that. It just says that the present exists. God exists in the present, and He can conceptually have properly basic beliefs about the truth of all future propositions. That's what I believe. I don't care what the open theists say. I think God has all knowledge of future contingents on a conceptual, properly basic level here in the present, even though the future doesn't exist.
So you don't think that presentism has any epistemological entailments. You just think
Yeah,
it's a metaphysical abstract that has nothing to say about what is knowable and what isn't.
when I took my master's in philosophy, like in secular philosophy, I can tell you it has nothing to do with God's epistemic knowability of this or that. It's strictly just what exists. Is it just the present that exists, or there's possibilism, which says the past and the present exist, but not the future,
Okay.
and there's eternalism. So
All
that's
right,
my.
but if you're a truth maker maximalist who has a commitment to the grounding objection, then presentism actually does have epistemological entailments. It has to.
I don't think so.
Otherwise, truth maker maximalism would be false.
I don't think so. Here's why. So I answered this in the last show, right? Because I think the truth makers of future tense propositions, all future tense are grounded in God's causal potential, which exists here in the present. And He would know about His own causal potentials if He activated this, that, what all of the entailments of that action would come about. So it's grounded. Future tense propositions are grounded in God's causal potential, which exists here in the present.
Okay, but well, that seems to collapse into causal determinism. God knows the future because He's going to cause the future. And if He
No,
causes the future, it cannot be otherwise. Doesn't
sorry,
that collapse into determinism?
no, because again, God's once He activates a certain causal potential, then okay, that causal chain can include libertarian free will decisions, which He knows in advance. Yeah, if I activate this potential by creating this world as a world number one as opposed to world number two, okay, yep, there are going to be certain causally determined things that take place. One thing leads to each other. But included in that are libertarian free will agents who are not causally determined, but will make their free will choices. And he just knows in advance conceptually what they're going to choose.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the key word, the key term there is causal potential.
Yeah.
God is making these future propositions possible even though He's not determining them. And since He knows what's possible, then He can know them even if they don't exist under presentism.
Yes, that's my answer. That obviously the open
Okay.
theism is different, but that's how I answer it as a Molinist and stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I agree with that in principle, because when you talked about causal, my mind was going to wait. You sound like you were saying the same thing that John Calvin said, that that God knows the future because He causes the future, because He determines the future, and so God's causality is not the ground of His knowledge, and therefore we can escape determinism by saying that. So you're saying that even though these things don't exist in the future, God can know them because of the fact that He can potentially cause the possibility that they can exist.
Yeah, like he has the
Okay.
causal potential, right? His power to activate this or this power, and he knows in advance what all the entailments of that will be, including what free will creatures will choose to do based on their circumstances.
Okay. All right. Well, I misunderstood. So thanks for clarifying that. Because when I heard the word causal, certain
Uh,
certain
I
alarms
will
started
make it.
going off in
I
my
will make
head.
I will make it clear. John Calvin is absolutely wrong. Calvinism is totally wrong. I am not a
Yeah.
Calvinist. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so and it does make sense on Molinism. And one of the points that I make in this paper that I wrote is that Molinism survives the survives whether the grounding objection is true or false. Molinism does not depend on the grounding objection,
Right.
and and I don't know whether the open theists recognize that or not, but I do know that the open theist is convinced that classical theism collapses into determinism. Because if God knows the future, then the future is settled. And they use the word settled quite often. At least I've heard them use the word settled quite a bit.
Yeah.
And 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 in my conversations with the open theists that I had last fall, prior to speaking at that church on open theism, we got together for a lunch that was supposed to last an hour and a half, and we started at noon, and we didn't get out of there until 5 o'clock.
Oh wow. Yeah. Yeah. It's
and and what they were telling me is that if God knows the future, then the future is settled, and therefore the future cannot be otherwise. And this is where I make a huge point in this paper. This is one of the fundamental fallacies of open theism. It's the modal fallacy between conflating what is actual and what is necessary. In other words, that God knows what will happen does not mean that it must happen and that it could not have been otherwise. And I think that just a large trajectory within open theism is this. I don't want to say desperate, because I think that has negative connotations that I don't think are true. They have this passionate, let's call it a passionate commitment to non-determinism. And so the reason they retreat from classical theism is they believe that if God knows the future perfectly, then the future is settled and cannot be otherwise. And so they cannot live with the idea that the future is determined and could not be otherwise. And so they reject classical theism and embrace open theism and say, no, that God does not know the future, and that's our escape hatch from determinism. And my reply is that is not the only escape hatch from determinism, because if you cease to make this modal mistake, if you cease to commit this modal fallacy, you will be able to see that you can escape determinism without denying God's foreknowledge, the future. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems with open theism, and that's one of my fundamental arguments against it. I think it is built on the foundation of a modal fallacy.
100% agree with you. And yeah, I think I'll link in my blog for people for this show. I'll link to a William Lane Craig has a Q&A where he describes this modal fallacy in very clear terms. Yeah, but I 100% agree with what Phil just said. Yeah,
Yeah.
well said. And yeah, open theists, it's game over on that front, I would say. So yeah,
And
sorry.
what I saw, I think it was also last year sometime, because Leighton Flowers also spoke at Agape Kingdom Fellowship. I think it's AK,
Hmm.
yeah, AG, whatever. He
Agape.
spoke at the same church that I did, Will Duffy's church. He spoke several weeks before I spoke on open theism, and Leighton was there speaking on some kind of aspect of determinism, and everybody was cheering him on. Yeah, the text doesn't say that. The text doesn't talk about determinism. And when I attended that service when Leighton was speaking, and then later that afternoon, he and I came up to my place and we grilled ribeyes and had a great time. And but when he was speaking, after the service was over, I stood up and Tim Barber was in the congregation, and he turned around and looked at me. He says, "You're Phil Bair," and I said, "You're Tim Barber," and and it reminded me of the debate that Tim Barber had with James White on determinism, whether there, and I don't remember what the exact wording of the proposition for the debate was, but James White was arguing for determinism, or what he calls decretalism, because he wants to escape the ugly implications of determinism. So he doesn't use that terminology. He uses the word decretalism, and he thinks that that has rescued him from all the ugly implications of determinism. And so he was arguing for a form of determinism that he calls decretalism, because he says determinism is a philosophical idea, and that he just confines all of his views to scripture, and which is rather silly. But Tim Barber was arguing from an open theist perspective, and James White was arguing from a Calvinist perspective. And what I call that debate was the grand, wonderful exercise in the false dichotomy, because Tim Barber's arguing against determinism on the basis of God being a temporal being, and God changing his mind, and God not knowing the future, and all these things. And James White is arguing for determinism. And and when I'm sitting here listening to this debate, and I'm thinking, yeah, both of you guys are mistaken. I mean, Tim Barber is not mistaken in the sense that he rejects determinism, but he's mistaken in the sense that he thinks that open theism is the only way to escape determinism, and it's not. It is simply a huge false dichotomy. And my friends that I met with for lunch that day, they just could not see it. They couldn't see the fact that classical theism with God's perfect foreknowledge does not entail determinism. And I tried my best to explain all those things, and I don't think that I got anywhere. Now, these guys are not dumb. They are brilliant guys, and they're extremely wise. They're wonderful disciples of Christ. I don't want to take away anything from their intelligence and from their wisdom whatsoever. But I was simply unable to show that this modal fallacy existed in open theism, and that it's fatal to open theism. So
Yeah, it's modal logic in general is tough for like people that are new and have, well, you said these guys were knowledgeable in it anyways, but yeah, yeah,
I don't I don't
go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I understood before I ever heard of modal logic or anything, but even I remember as a high school student, I understood this with I couldn't have explained it in terms of modal logical fallacies and technicalities like that, but I did have this basic intuitive awareness of this distinction here. And I always remember thinking like just because you God knows the future, that doesn't mean it's determined like, oh, like God is, I don't have free will. And I always thought I could never understand why people thought that was a good objection. And it's because I inherently recognize this modal logic fallacy before I ever had the terminology to understand that's what it was. When I
Right.
saw that, I was like, oh, that's what I was thinking back as a high school student. That's what I had in mind and why you guys were wrong. And I knew that, but I didn't have the words to express it.
Yeah, modal logic is a scary term, but everybody knows it intuitively.
Yeah.
I think it's not very complicated actually. It's a little scary because of the terminology, but it's not that complicated. It's distinguishing between what is actual, what's necessary, what's possible, what's not possible, and that kind of thing. And so if you understand the terms necessary and possible and actual and all these things, then you've got a pretty basic grasp of modal logic. And even though you can develop it into something that's far more complicated, the fundamental components of modal logic are pretty simple.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
basically look, there are different there are different modes in which something can exist. It can exist out of necessity. It can exist contingently. Oh, am I still there?
yep, you are.
Oh, okay. Just yeah, or it could be logically impossible for it to exist. So think of it that way. Like what are
Yeah.
the different modes that things can exist in? That's what modal logic is.
Well, I would say that that's modal ontology. I would say that's not modal logic because modal logic is not about existence. Modal logic is about bivalence. It's about the truth values of propositions. So a
Right.
proposition can be necessarily true, or it can be possibly true, or it can be actually true, and all those kinds of things. So I focus really more on the propositional aspects of modal logic more than the ontological aspects. But I'm sure that you can
You're correct.
expand this into a whole lot of different disciplines and a whole lot of different areas. So I don't want to diminish what you're saying. I've always thought of it as primarily related to propositions and not necessarily ontology. So
No, you are right. Yeah,
but I,
that's the way I meant it, I guess. So yeah.
but Dale, guess what?
What?
I could be wrong.
I don't think you are wrong in this case,
I,
but yeah,
well, I,
go ahead.
I was thinking about when before we did this broadcast, I was thinking that I needed to make sure that in my opening comments that I include the declaration that Phil Bair could be wrong. Phil Bair is not infallible, and I have no narcissistic desire to always be right.
Says the guy
I,
who's
I,
invented an entire theory of time named after himself. The big theory of time.
and I will be the first one to say that my entire theory of time that I supposedly invented could be false.
There we go. And it is.
So just because I invented it doesn't mean that I'm going to insist that it's true. And I'm open to challenge, and that's not problematic for me at all. This is about humility. But I want to move on real quickly. We're at the 2 hour 9 minute mark. So I don't want to go too much longer, but I do want to cover a few things that were part of this conversation between Warren and Chris. And there was a question in the live chat that said, "Why is this called ignoring the rooster? What does a rooster have to do with this conversation?" And do you know what it has to do with this conversation, Dale?
Well, yeah, I think it's basically the biblical example of Peter that we brought up in the first show,
Right,
right? And the prediction. Yeah.
right. And so the reason I'm calling it ignoring the rooster is that we got pushback from Warren and Chris when we insisted that the Christ prediction of Peter's denial was an example of perfect foreknowledge. And they pushed back on that, and the typical narrative from the open theist is that Jesus knew that Peter would deny him because Jesus knew Peter in the present so well that he was able to calculate and deduce that Peter would deny Jesus based on Jesus' understanding of Peter's character, his personality, his influences, and his past patterns, and so on. And And what I have to say about that is my reaction to that is you're ignoring the rooster. Because Jesus didn't just say, Peter, you're gonna deny me. You're gonna deny that you even know me. He didn't just say that. He said, you're gonna deny that you know me, and you're gonna do it 3 times. And I think it's inconceivable that Jesus could know Peter's personality so well that he could actually tell us how many times Peter was going to deny him. And not only that, but if God and Jesus and his omniscience, even if he could predict that Peter would deny him 3 times just because he knows Peter so well, which I think is absurd, but that doesn't explain the fact that he knew that Peter would deny him right before the rooster crows.
Yeah,
So
oh, I was.
the
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say, back you up on that. I totally agree with what you're saying here. Look, God has perfect. Let's posit like the open theist. God has perfect knowledge of the present and knows all of these evidential features and stuff like that. If we were to put that all of that knowledge into premise format, you would still have a non sequitur. You would have an invalid or a non cogent argument. It's just insufficient to get to the conclusion. Peter will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. It's a
Right.
non sequitur, even if you grant everything the open theists want in terms of God's knowledge of the present.
Because here's the central claim of open theism is that God cannot predict with absolute precision and flawless accuracy that Peter's going to deny him 3 times because God can't know the future because he can't know future libertarian choices. But if he can't know the future because he can't know libertarian choices in the future, then he can't know that Peter's going to deny him. Because if he did, then that means that he would know Peter's future libertarian choices, and that is a denial of one of the fundamental principles of open theism. God does not know the future because he does not know future libertarian choices. And so not only would Jesus not be able to know that Peter was going to deny him because he doesn't know future libertarian choices, but he couldn't know that Peter was going to do that 3 times. So the fact that Jesus couldn't know it, that he did it 3 times or was going to do it 3 times, that's even more of a reductio than just the fact that Jesus didn't know for certain that Peter would do that because he doesn't know future libertarian choices. But on top of all that, you've got Jesus knowing how many times Peter was going to deny him, and he knew that a rooster was going to crow twice right after Peter denies him. He said, "You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows twice." Now, what that means is that the open theist is going to have to say that Jesus knew that rooster, that specific rooster. He knew its biology and he knew all of its influences. He knew everything about that rooster in terms of its influences from natural law and circumstantial reality and all these various things that Jesus was able to accurately predict that the rooster was going to crow twice right after Peter denied him 3 times. And that was all based on Jesus' incredible calculus of the future, based on his understanding of natural law. That's what would have to happen. And as soon as the open theist says that, what's my first question going to be, Dale? How do you know? Aren't you begging the question in favor of open theism and then superimposing open theism onto the text of Scripture and onto history? There is no textual support for the fact that Jesus knew the natural law causes and influences so well that he could accurately predict that this rooster was going to crow twice and that Peter was going to deny him 3 times. It is so question begging. It is absolute, pure question begging. And that's not exegesis, that's eisegesis. That's superimposing a preconceived ideology onto the text and forcing the text to say what your preconceived ideology wants it to say. And what that is that is basically exegetical violence. It's nothing less than exegetical violence.
Yep.
So that's why it's called ignoring the rooster.
I totally agree. Yeah, there's nothing for me to really add to you. I think you stated that perfectly. So yeah, I'm in full agreement on my end.
Okay. Well, the other thing that I think it was Chris who said this. I'm not sure. So if I'm mistaken on that, then I'm open to correction. But I think Chris was the one who said that we appeal to Jesus' omniscience because of the fact that Scripture in several places says that Jesus knew or knows all things. And so when Jesus was restoring Peter, he said, Peter, do you love me? And at some point, Peter said, you, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And a classical theist will interpret that as saying that Jesus has perfect knowledge, perfect omniscience of everything that can be known, or everything that he knows everything, basically. And so the pushback from the open theist, and I think from Chris, was, well, the Bible says that a whole lot of people know all things. The Bible says that believers know all things, and there are various verses in the Bible where it says that about believers. So he said, if the fact that Jesus knows all things makes him omniscient, then doesn't that make believers omniscient as well? Because believers are said to know all things in the Bible in addition to that. And my pushback there is that Jesus has two natures. He has, and they also brought up the fact that there's some things that Jesus did not know. So they're combining the fact that some human beings are said to know all things with the fact that Jesus does not know certain things. He doesn't know the day and the hour of his coming. That only the Father knows that. And so Chris and most open theists are going to say, see, Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, is not omniscient because there are certain things that he didn't know. And so my explanation of that is that we appeal to what's called the hypostatic union. Is that the right term, Dale?
Yes, it is. Yep.
And the hypostatic union is the doctrine that Jesus has two natures. When he was living on earth in his incarnate state, he had a divine nature and a human nature. In fact, he still has a human nature, I think, according to the doctrine of hypostatic union. And so Jesus, in his human nature, in his incarnate nature, where he voluntarily suppresses certain divine privileges and divine attributes, can lack certain knowledge during his time on earth. And so the fact that he has a human nature explains the fact that he does not know certain things during his incarnation. But he also predicts various outcomes before they happen, and he predicts them with absolute precision, and we can explain that by the fact that he has a divine nature, and that he didn't lose his divine nature during the incarnation. He simply suppressed it occasionally in order to do the Father's will, in order to fulfill divine purposes. And so this false equivalence exists between certain people being said to know all things and Jesus being said to know all things, and that's a huge mistake to simply say that because people are said to know all things and they're not obviously not omniscient, that therefore when it says that Jesus knows all things, then we can also assume that he's not omniscient because for the same reason. And I think that completely ignores the distinction between between Jesus' human nature and between his divine nature. And I think it ignores the whole hypostatic union doctrine. And unless they want to reject the doctrine of the hypostatic union, then I think they need to abandon that whole line of reasoning. What
Yeah,
say you?
I think, yeah, so I agree. So look, in the first place, I would say this is a place where Jesus changed, a lateral change, right? So there are different modes of omniscience. As Phil said, sometimes he will suppress certain features. So Jesus, when he became incarnate, went from being consciously omniscient to subconsciously omniscient, I would say. So that's why he's not consciously knowing, but he still retains the knowledge of that true proposition and is therefore omniscient. It's just in his subconscious mind. Same way, Jesus had with omnipotence. He had active omnipotence, and while he was during his time of humiliation, you could say he had passive omnipotence or something like that. That's not the word I wanted to use, but it's not active omnipotence or something. But there is this thing in philosophy called the iterativeness principle, which says, look, if you have the power to acquire the power to do something, it's exactly the same as you having the power to do something. And that's what I think applies to Jesus's subconscious omniscience. He had the power to become consciously omniscient again. He freely chose to keep that knowledge subconscious. The only thing I'll add to what Phil said is we have to remember, though, I don't think it's just a matter of the incarnation as the explanation here, because the Holy Spirit never became incarnate. And supposedly it's only God the Father that has the knowledge of when the end will come. So even though the Holy Spirit's not incarnate, it also has subconscious knowledge in terms of when the end will come. So yeah, that's my answer there is pretty much in line with you, Phil.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Fully agree. And that point about the Holy Spirit is spot on. That's it's possible for God to suppress awareness, and then for it to be accurate to say that God does not know some things, but we have to be careful to explain what that really means. It doesn't mean that he doesn't know it intuitively, that it is somehow absent from his knowledge. It means that it's possible for God to suppress knowledge, and it's possible for members of the Trinity to suppress knowledge as in a voluntarily sense, so that they can do the will of the Father voluntarily and they can submit to the Father. And so,
The way the way
yeah,
I
that's
the way I'd phrase that, just to keep it straight, is it he always has knowledge. He retains his knowledge, but he's just not consciously aware of his knowledge of certain propositions and or
voluntarily.
voluntarily. Yeah, exactly.
And but I want to get back to the memory point because I just remembered something else that they said, that Warren and Chris said. They said that God knows the past because he remembers the past because of his memory, and we know that God has memory because there are various places in the Bible where sorry, God says, "Let's reason together." Though your sins be as scarlet, or I don't remember if I don't if it's in this part, but there's a part in the Old Testament where he says, "I will remember your sins no more." And so they're pointing to the language of memory, of remembering in the Old Testament, and they're using that to support the claim that God has a memory. And Dale, how would you respond to that? Because I know how I would, but I want to see how you would.
Okay. Well, I up until today, I would have agreed with them. I didn't have an issue with God having a memory, but now having heard your argumentation, but that's derivative knowledge. Now I'm kind of changing my mind. So I think I would say God's knowledge of the past, even though it doesn't exist, is grounded in exactly the same way his knowledge of future tense propositions. It's grounded in his causal potential, his knowledge of his own causal potential, and all of the entailments, past, present, and future, that come about in result of him activating one power over another. So yeah, his knowledge is just past based on his the what his causal potential has entailed given the certain circumstances that were present back at that past coordinate or something like that. So hopefully that makes, I hope that makes sense. But it's kind of the same thing with regard to future tense, just in reverse. And that's, so it's a conceptual based knowledge. It's not really memory is where I'm leaning to now. But before I would have fully agreed with them until today. So now I'm, yeah.
Well, I would argue, and I could be wrong, so I'm not infallible, but I would argue that when God says, I will remember their sins no more, I don't think that's a reference to actual memory. I think cognitive memory, I think that's a reference to judicial memory. And what I mean by that is that if I went to court and paid a traffic ticket. So let's say I was caught speeding and I got a ticket and I got to go down to the courthouse and I got to pay my fine. I could go to the judge and I could say, "Here's my fine. I'm paying my fine for this traffic ticket." The judge could say to me, "Okay, Phil, I will remember your ticket no more." Now, does that mean that he is actually removing his knowledge of that ticket from his cognitive awareness? Or is it saying that I am not going to hold you accountable for this ticket anymore because justice has been satisfied? And I think that's what God is saying. He's saying your sins have been taken care of. They've been forgiven. And so justice, my divine justice has been satisfied. And so in that sense, I'm never going to bring it up again. And that's what happens when we have forgiveness. When we forgive our loved ones from something that they've done wrong to hurt us or something like that, we can forgive and then blot it out of our memory in the sense that I'm not going to bring it up anymore. I'm not going to hold you accountable for this anymore. And I think that's really what God was saying when he said, I will remember your sins no more. And then there's other parts in the Bible where it says God remembers certain things that someone did in the past. I've remembered your suffering, and I think that's just simply an anthropomorphism. And the Bible is full of anthropomorphisms, and I think that they are passages, and I think they are propositions in the Bible that the open theist takes way, way, way too literally. And so,
I was just going to say I agree. I agree with your reading on that. I didn't mean to say that I agreed with them on the Bible verse. I was talking more like in the abstract.
yeah,
So yeah, I agree with your interpretation of those verses. It's not literal. God will remember versus forget or something. Yeah, you're right on that.
right. And one of the things that I was talking about with my open theist friends was that they told me, well, God searches the heart. And God searches this and God searches that. And so they're saying, well, that means that God acquires knowledge because he's searching for something he doesn't know is there, and then he discovers that it's there as a result of his searching. And again, my reply to that is that's not a matter of God not knowing something in advance and then looking for it and then finding it and then finally learning something from what he found or what he observed. That's not what it means for God to search. What the fact that God searches the heart means that God is able to penetrate all of our ontological existence, and he's able to, that nothing is hidden from him. And that's another part of omniscience, I think, and that's a big part of omniscience. Nothing is hidden from God's knowledge. And when it says that God searches the heart, what that all that means is that our hearts are not hidden from God. That's really all it means. And so again, it's another example where the open theists are taking the Old Testament and sometimes even the New Testament way too literally. And it happens when they say that believers know all things, that you have been taught by God, and so now you know all things, and they're taking that so literally that they're saying that if we want to interpret that as a statement of omniscience, then we're falling into error at that point. So So, and in that case, I guess you would say that the open theist is really not taking it literally. They're saying that we shouldn't take it literally, but we also shouldn't take it literally when it's said of Jesus, and I think that's where the mistake is being made. Yeah, so,
Gotcha. Yeah.
yeah,
Nothing to add. Yeah, like I said, I agree with your interpretation of those anthropometric. That's the wrong way. Anthropomorphic texts and stuff like that. Yeah, God doesn't actually forget in the sense that did that guy sin or not? I can't remember. No, it's talking judiciously and stuff like that. So yeah, I agree with your take on those.
yeah. And I also brought up a lot of verses in the Old Testament from Isaiah, for example, about the divine, or the test of divinity. And so God is saying, okay, all you idols out there, foretell the future for me. Prove that you're divine. Prove that you are worthy of worship by foretelling the future. And that was God's test for divinity, is knowing the future. And the pushback that I get from the open theists is that God was not talking about foretelling the future of contingent events. He was talking about foretelling what he would do in the future. And so what I want to do is look up that verse right there. It says Isaiah 41 verse 23 says, "Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods." And so what God is saying is, and this is God speaking, he is saying, tell us the future, foretell the future, and therefore we will know that you are gods. But in the last half of verse 23, it says, do a bunch of impressive things so that we can be terrified, and so that you can prove that your divinity that way. And I don't, let me look up the exact verse and I'll read it to you. This is Isaiah 41, verse 23. It says, tell us what the future holds so that we may know that you are gods. Do something, whether good or bad, so that we will be dismayed and filled with fear, or filled with terror. And so the open theist points to that and says, well, this is where you really get the context for this passage. What God is talking about is not being able to foretell the future accurately. What he's talking about is, I'm going to do something in the future, and therefore that's going to prove that I'm God. In other words, and we talked about this, Dale. We talked about this in our first episode, in our first podcast. In other words, if I say I'm going to go to the grocery store tomorrow, and then when tomorrow comes and I go to the grocery store, everybody's going to be so impressed. Aren't I godlike because I went to the grocery store and I predicted that I was going to go to the grocery store the day before? So that's what the open theist is saying is happening here. God is simply telling us what he's going to do, and then he does it. And so the fact that he can foretell what he's going to do, and state his intentions, and then actually carry out his intentions, that proves that he's God. Well, if that's the case, then doesn't that prove that I'm God also? If I say tomorrow I'm gonna jump across the Grand Canyon, and that would be a really impressive thing to do, and then tomorrow I go to the Grand Canyon and I jump across it. Now I can't jump across the Grand Canyon, but if I did something very impressive, does that mean that I'm a god? And so obviously not. And the plain language of Isaiah 41 verses 22 and 23 is, tell us, you idols, what is going to happen. It doesn't say, tell us, you idols, what you're going to do. It says, tell us what is going to happen. Tell us what the former things were. And when it talks about the former things, it's talking about things that occurred in the past, in history, so that we may consider them and know their final outcome. Or declare us the things to come. Tell us what the future holds, so that we may know you are God. So when it says declare the things to come, that's a reference to actual events in the future. It's not a reference to what those beings are going to do in the future. So this is the divine test of divinity, and it's impossible for the open theist to get around this. This is actually telling us that God knows the future with flawless accuracy. He's not just predicting it, he's not just forecasting it. He's not just a divine weatherman that really knows the present so well that he can predict the future based on his calculations. This is talking about tell us the things to come. And by the way, if God predicts the future and doesn't predict it flawlessly and accurately, then how is this a divine test? How is it a test of divinity? Because if he predicts the future probabilistically, then the ones that are being challenged here could say, "Well, you just got lucky. You didn't predict it perfectly and accurately. You just predicted it with pretty good precision." And if God can't predict the future perfectly based on his perfect foreknowledge, then this ceases to become a test for deity, and it simply falls flat, and it's not going to impress anybody.
Fair
What say
enough.
you?
Yeah, I can't really think of anything. I kind of said in the first show, like I agree totally with your take that it is this test of knowledge, not a test of power. So yeah, I didn't find Warren or Chris's interpretation persuasive. That's what the text has in mind. That it is this. I mean, it is true that Isaiah does stress the difference between, hey, you're impotent gods versus, my God can actually do things. He's alive, he's living, and stuff like that, versus your dead God. So that is a theme. They're correct about that in Isaiah. But is that what he has in mind in this text? I don't think so. I think it is that.
Well,
Yeah.
I think he has both in mind in the text. But the fact that he also talks about future deeds doesn't mean that he's not talking about future knowledge and future events. So it's kind of a both and then to focus on one of them to the exclusion of the other is a huge exegetical mistake in my view. So
Yeah, yeah. When it comes to this text in particular, like I said, I really it really seems clear that the test is just about the,
right.
hey, my God's not I'm not something like that. You can actually do stuff. That's not what's doesn't seem to me what the text is saying here. So yeah, I agree with you.
Hmm.
And it's interesting. It might be both. So I'd have to relook at that there. Yeah.
Well, so
Oh,
share with us some more things that you have in your notes. I know you had some more points that you wanted to cover and that you wanted to share.
believe it or not, so I was good. I think we fit in everything. Especially the point that I wanted to go over the knowledge. We went over presentism like crazy. We covered that the Bible says God is timeless and temporal. We both agreed on that. And we covered the God's sovereignty and aseity issue. That I don't think we cut. Okay, so one thing I'll answer. Robot says open theists hate Plato and Aristotle. So okay, fair enough. That's true. I remember Warren saying Westerners and logic and stuff like that's no good. He prefers more of an Eastern mindset and stuff. So I guess an open theist could go for an anti-realist position with respect to propositions to escape my argument that there needs to be a grounding for propositions that exist. But even under the anti-realist notion, they need, they, yeah, they, for lack of a better words, they need an explanation, and that can only be within a mind, God, and stuff like that. So I just don't see the anti-realist escape way as a way of getting around that argument, to be honest.
When when
Um,
you say
Go
anti-realist,
ahead.
are you talking about the idea that time isn't real, or that
With respect to like propositions or mathematical numbers and stuff like that, like William Lane Craig, for example, takes an anti-realist that they're not things that
yeah,
actually
propositions are
exist.
not real? Yeah.
Exist. I just don't think that works. I think propositions really do exist, and I'm a divine conceptualist. That what are they? These are thoughts that exist in some kind of mind. and that has to be the
Yeah,
mind
when
of
I
God.
read that from William Lane Craig, when he said that propositions don't exist, the first thing that popped into my head was, well, if propositions don't exist, then how can they have bivalence? How can they have the property of true or false? Something that doesn't exist cannot have properties, but propositions have
Right.
properties, namely true or false, meaningful, not meaningful. And so I
There's also the property. Oh, sorry. There's also the property of it. Propositions have the property of the multiple. It's called the multiple realization problem, right? Because the same proposition could be in your head and simultaneously in my head at the same time, right? So it's not like, oh, we're having different propositions as though they're different whatevers or something. No, it's a thing that exists and exists in different minds
right.
simultaneously. So that's another property of propositions and numbers and stuff. There is one point I don't think we covered adequately. It's my last point. This issue of the implication that the open theist is not a maximally great being, and there's this problem because they don't know the future of free will creatures and future contingents, stuff like that. It means from the perspective of God at the time, okay, I'm going to die on the cross and atone for people's sins. His whole salvation plan is in jeopardy. From the perspective of saving as many free will creatures as possible. He just even right now as we speak, God has no idea whether he's going to accomplish his goal. If he just sacked 2 years earlier, more souls would have been saved. Or, if I made the joke, if he died on the cross wearing a tutu, more people would have been saved. Or, had all of these future from his perspective in 30 AD contingents, he achieves his goal of saving as many free creatures as possible. He doesn't have a clue. He's just praying for the best. And on that front, I would say even the act of creation, going back to before creation, before in a logical sense, not a chronological sense necessarily, it makes no sense. It would work because God has no idea. He can't make all of the evaluation value judgments necessary to say, well, yeah, it's worth it to create. It's a good thing to create. It's at least as equally valuable as a world where I exist alone and don't create. For all, if I exist to create this world with all with evil and suffering that I can predict will happen, maybe it'll be a worse world than if I just don't create. Like he lacks the knowledge necessary to justify his acts of creation. He doesn't know whether he can accomplish his salvation plan. He doesn't have a clue how many free will people will be saved versus not when he's on the cross. He doesn't even know whether the act of creation is justified or not if you're an open theist. So like, what do you make of that objection?
Well, yeah, I think it's a strong objection, but I think that you should write an article where you present a formal argument that says that if Jesus died wearing a pink tutu, that more ballerinas would come to Christ. Are you there?
Hello? Hello?
Hello, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Did you freeze up again?
I think I was hearing you, but I don't think you were hearing me. So I was just saying, yeah, the pink tutu defeater for open theism. I will get straight on that. You have to post it up on the free thinking blog for me. So
Okay. Well, if you write it, I'll ask the guys to publish it.
oh, are
The
you serious or yeah? Okay, all right, yeah, I'll get
the the,
work right.
the pink tutu argument against open theism.
I
Yeah.
okay, I will actually do this. Yeah, that'll be great.
And so, okay, well, yeah, I think your point is valid, and I don't see any problem with that. The and I wanted to share something from my paper real quickly because this has to do with another fundamental category mistake in open theism. We may have touched on this a little bit already, but I want to kind of expand on it, and I want to make it a little bit more clear and give it a little more traction. In the in the paper, let me just quote from the paper real quickly. He says this treatment of classical theism is a profound fallacy. In other words, it's a fallacy that God does not think. Open theists under what they think is a crushing blow, or thunder what they think is a crushing blow to classical theism. God does not think. His mind is frozen. He's not relational, responsive, or dynamic. He's not a person. He's a statue. All because he doesn't think. There can be no process or procedure in God's mind. He doesn't work things out. He doesn't communicate, since that would require a time-situated relational process. Under classical theism, God is not a time oriented being. He's just a static wax figure no human being can relate to. And then I said, this treatment of classical theism is a profound fallacy. We contingent humans approach truth as climbing a ladder, moving from premise to premise until we grasp a conclusion. By contrast, God's intellect is like an artist who beholds the completed masterpiece without sketching it first. He does not ascend. For him, there is no before or after. Every truth, past, present, and future, is simultaneously in his view. To speak of God thinking is therefore true in an analogical sense. He is supremely rational and perfectly aware. But to construe his awareness as equivalent with our stepwise reasoning is to impose creaturely limitations on the Creator. And then this is the important paragraph. This exposes one of the most fundamental category mistakes in open theism. Thinking is impossible without the passage of time for contingent beings. Being responsive, relational, personal, reactive, and dynamic is impossible without the passage of time for contingent beings. Not being a wax figure and metaphysically frozen is impossible without the passage of time for contingent beings. There's no basis whatsoever that these things must be true of a non-contingent necessary being. We worship the infinite personal God Francis Schaeffer spoke of, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is altogether other than the creatures he created. So the idea that God is frozen in time, or just frozen period, that he is totally static, that he doesn't think, he can't relate to human beings, is an entailment, would be an entailment for contingent beings, but I think they're missing a fundamental distinction, and that is that God is not a contingent being. And so therefore their conclusion that God must be static and frozen simply because his nature doesn't change is completely incoherent, because we don't know that's true of a non-contingent necessary being. He's the infinite personal God. And so you can't expect things that are true for human beings, contingent beings, to be true of God. And so all those entailments of classical theism, they completely break down, they completely fall apart.
Yeah, I think I totally. So I understand what they're saying in terms of a timeless God being a statue. I think they're correct to an extent, but you're absolutely correct to say that it is a straw man to literally think of him as a statue, because obviously I believe God was timeless without creation. So I'm the same as you on this front, and no one, I mean, neither myself nor Dr. William Lane Craig would want to think that, oh, he's literally a statue, he can't relate. Look, for as a timeless being, he had eternal loving relationships between uh, each of the three members of the Trinity, totally without creation and stuff like that. And these were real relationships. Now, they weren't dynamic, obviously, because he's timeless. So they were static in that sense. But that doesn't mean they're any less valuable or any less, good compared. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. Any less valuable or any less meaningful than what we have with dynamic relations through time and stuff like that. It's exactly the same. They're equally valuable, in my opinion. Yeah, these personal relationships, whether you're timeless or temporal, and in that sense, I agree with you that it is a straw man to say he's just statue kind of thing, that we can't engage in any personal relationships. No, his mode of eternality has no bearing on that. So I agree with you on that.
Right. Hudson TD says, could an earthly father not say to his adult child that you, my child, will deny me 3 times in front of your friends before the rooster crows twice? I could say that the earthly father could say that to his adult child, but would he be able to say it with confidence? Can he say it and be absolutely correct? Can he predict it with flawless accuracy? And I would say no, he can't. So the question is, can the earthly father say this to a child? And I don't think that's the right question. I think the question is, can an earthly father know that about what his adult child will do with absolute precision? And my answer would be no. No, the father couldn't do that. So,
Yeah.
and then he says it's not an absolute claim about what Peter will do. It was a present tense acknowledgement or acknowledgement of Peter faith at that present moment as weak. It was a test for Peter not to deny him 3 times. Okay, I'm not sure. I think I understand what he's saying. That it was not an absolute claim. It was not an absolute prediction. It was a present tense acknowledgement for Peter that at the present moment he is weak, and so it's a test for Peter not to deny him 3 times. In other words, it's saying Jesus is saying, Peter, hey, don't deny me 3 times. I'm going to give you a test, and if you deny me 3 times, you're going to fail the test. If you don't deny me 3 times, then you pass the test.
That's way too specific for a test. Like I can imagine a test like, oh, you will deny me. Are you going to deny me or are you going to stay faithful? But you're going to deny me three
Okay,
times before the rooster crows twice. That's not a test. That's you know what I mean. But
and
yeah, go ahead, Phil.
that's the reason for the title of this podcast, ignoring the rooster. Was it a test for the rooster also? Was it a test that the rooster was going to crow twice at the same proximate time that Peter was going to deny him? See the whole argument, the whole idea that it was just a test for Peter falls completely apart when you consider the rooster. So my response to that would be, don't ignore the rooster. Let's stop ignoring the rooster because that was not a test for Rooster. This was not a libertarian choice on the part of the Rooster. And to think that Jesus was able to predict what the Rooster would do with such precision based on his current knowledge of the biological Rooster is unbelievably question begging. So I think that the best answer that I can give to Hudson's question is that I think the idea that it was a test for Peter ignores the rooster.
Fair enough. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you got your ignoring rooster argument, and I got my pink tutu atonement argument. So
I think we get a ticket on the road, buddy.
there we go.
We
The
we
comedy
need
duo of the century.
we need to sell tickets. Well, I'm sure that there are lots of points that they made that Warren and Chris made in that video, and I texted Warren and asked him if he would be able to come on the show today, and he said that it wasn't feasible for him this weekend. But I do want to have Warren on, and I do want to have this conversation with Warren because it would be much more personal that way. And I have so much affection and respect for Warren that I think it would be more productive for us to have this conversation in a way that wouldn't be possible when we just simply do these responses to these videos and we don't involve the other people. So I would like to involve Warren, and he said he would be interested in coming on and having this conversation in real time together directly. And
Yeah, yeah,
I
I'd
would
love
like I would like to do that at some point, and it's right now it's just a matter of scheduling, I think. And so what I'll do is I'll text Warren and ask him if he can do that, or when he can do that, because he's already said that he would like to. And it would be an extremely productive conversation because Warren is such a good guy and he's so genuine. There isn't I don't know that I could say there isn't an arrogant bone in his body because he's admitted that sometimes he's been a little snarky with some people, but I think we all have. I have to admit that there are times when I've let my guard down and wasn't as charitable as I could be, and so I repent of that. I don't think that's pleasing to God. And if Warren has ever done that, like he's suggested that he might have, then I forgive him. But his overall demeanor is consistently charitable and respectful, and I don't see him as being some kind of a arrogant debater. And I do know of people who are like that. I
Yeah,
do know of people who are so arrogant, and I know of people that for them it is all about winning. That's all they care about, and I think that's unfortunate. And so it's a lesson for me, Phil. Be humble. Don't be arrogant. Don't think that you always have to be right. Just be committed to always being truthful. And so I think that's going to help a lot. And I've grown quite a bit in the last decades in that regard. And that's why I can say with confidence that I could be wrong about these things, and I can't repeat that often enough. So
awesome. Yeah, I totally concur. Obviously I don't have as much experience with Warren. I've been on one or two shows with him, but perfect time. I've seen shows with him and stuff like that, and yeah, he's got a genuine good faith spirit, which is
is
what
that
I
is that
look.
your phone?
It's my phone. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Um, but yeah, and that's what I look for. You know what I mean? Like, I don't even think there's a problem with having a little bit of fun or snarkiness as long as it's in good humor, occasionally and done from time to time. So I appreciate that. And in terms of his show, I didn't even see any snarkiness or anything like that. It was all done in good faith. So yeah, I mean, I if he wants me involved in that show as well, I would love to be able to speak with him and discuss his ideas on open theism and stuff like that. So yeah,
Yeah.
and even if it's just you and him, I'll be in the audience for sure watching it.
Well, I would like you to be part of it because they responded to both of us. So I think, and if you two haven't had a chance to interact, I think it'd be a great opportunity because he would be able to get to know how genuine you are. I think he probably already knows it, but he'd be able to experience how genuine you are, and you'd be able to experience how genuine Warren is because he's such a sweet guy, and I have the highest regard for him. Hudson TD said the Rooster Crow is my next comment, so I apologize because I didn't see that following comment, and so and I don't I could go
He's,
back and look for it.
I think he's saying is next, so he's going to be posting it after that, but he
No,
hasn't.
I think it was his next comment after the one that I posted and talked about. I
Oh,
think that's what he's saying.
okay. I don't know. Yeah.
I'm not seeing it at the moment, but so I apologize. I didn't mean to treat that as though that was your final position or your final question. So ahead and forgive me, and hopefully
He's saying how much time went by from Jesus saying this about Peter to until it manifested in time with the rooster crowing. So I think he's trying to say, like, aren't you assuming that as soon as Peter denied him three times, that rooster crowed immediately, or maybe it was 5 minutes later or something?
I think according to the text, it seems to be rather immediate, and in fact, according to the account in Mark, the rooster crowed before Peter actually denied him the third time, and that after Peter denied him the third time, that was when the rooster crowed a second time. So if we look at if we look at the passage in, I think it's Mark 13, might not be 13, might be, yeah, it's 14. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls and the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You were also with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." And again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near to Peter said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." And verse 71 says, "He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, 'I don't know this man you're talking about.'" And then verse 72 says, "Immediately the rooster crowed the second time." Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. So I think according to the passage, this was all pretty much happening almost simultaneously. It says immediately the rooster crowed the second time, right after the third time that Peter had denied him. And and when it says immediately the rooster crowed a second time, that implies that the rooster crowed the first time somewhere between his first and second denials, or first, second, and third denials. So the rooster might have crowed between the first and second, or between the second and third, but it doesn't say which. But then it says immediately the rooster crowed the second time, and so and it says some manuscripts do not have the phrase the second time. So some manuscripts say immediately the rooster crowed. And so the word immediately there, I think, suggests to me that it was almost almost simultaneous, so just extremely close in time. I don't think that there were hours between them or anything like that. So
Yeah, I agree. I've always read it as though it was an immediate thing that happened right after. So yeah.
yeah. And then Hudson TD says, "Thanks for the discussion. It was fun. Get Tim Barber on as well." And I have been working on that quite a bit, because Tim Barber and I communicate once in a while, and I would love to have Tim Barber on and get his perspectives on what we talked about, and his perspectives about open theism, because I think this is an extremely important discussion and an important topic, because if it's true that God is not truly omniscient in the classical sense, then that has huge implications for the nature of God. And whenever you start messing around with the nature of God, things cannot end up well if you're not careful. And it can have tremendous implications for our discipleship and even for our eternal salvation, I think. So, and Chris says the roosters tune one, two, three, three crows and one cockadoodle doo.
That's the best argument I've heard of this entire show. Yeah,
Yeah,
he wins.
exactly. The philosophical precision here is astounding. So,
Good
all
job.
right, we've been going 3 hours, and so I will try to follow up with Warren, and hopefully we can schedule another time where we can have this conversation directly with each other in real time. I think that will be beneficial. And if there's anything that I have misrepresented about Warren's position or Chris's position, then I think that these guys will let me know. Warren will at least let me know. And if I have misrepresented anything that Warren or Chris said, then I absolutely want to apologize. It's not intentional, believe me, and because I don't want to be inaccurate. I always want to represent people accurately and fairly. So I think that'll be great. So everybody, just kind of stay tuned, and I look forward to that happening. And I hope everyone who's joined us today can join us for that whenever it occurs and whenever we can schedule it. So,
Yeah.
any closing comments, Mr. Dale?
Yeah. Just say I think this has been really great, really in depth conversation and stuff, and it's been mutually respectful, civil, and substantive on both sides. In terms of Warren and Chris, and in terms of our giving our feedback in our initial video, also in the chat. I mean, a lot of great chats coming in and stuff like that. So I'm appreciative of this, and 100% I am down to be in the show with Warren. I'll make it happen. I'll be as flexible as I can to make for whatever works for you and Warren on that front.
Okay.
One thing I will say, just for my audience. So obviously, this is being live streamed to my channel. Phil asked me to do that, so I'm gonna post up this show today or tomorrow morning on all my platforms. But I also will be posting up tomorrow after church or Monday at the latest my show on the resurrection, because I just did a 4 hour debate before I came on with Phil. I was doing a literally a debate on the resurrection, but specifically the nuanced point of, does the Bible support evidentialism with respect to the resurrection, or does it support the blind faith thing? So I'll have that posted up as well within the next couple days for people.
Yeah, it's hard for me to conceive of the debate about the Bible being an evidentialist document. It's hard for me to conceive of that going for 4 hours. To me, that would go for about 4 minutes. We can settle it. We can settle it pretty quickly because the apostles in the book of Acts, they appealed to eyewitness testimony. They appealed to historical evidence, and their entire approach was evidentialistic, if that's a word. I don't. Is that a word, Dale? Evidentialistic.
I'm adding it to the dictionary as we speak, but
Oh, good, good. Thank you.
I've added evidence is apparently a word for us too, but yeah, it's
Be sure.
huh? You'd
Be
be
sure and give me an attribution. So in the dictionary.
of course, yeah, but you'd be surprised at how the mind of an atheist or a skeptic can take something that seems obviously true and contort it and twist it into something that's not. So I think you'll enjoy. It's me and my old co-host David Johnson from Skeptics and Seekers, who is the atheist doing this, but we always have fun,
Okay.
kind of ribbing each other and stuff. But yeah, it was a great show.
Yeah, I've had conversations with David. He's a great guy.
Absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
David Johnson a lot. Yeah, good guy. Praying for him to convert.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And
Go ahead.
and I have heard atheists tell Christians that the evidence is no good, but I haven't heard very many atheists actually claim that the Bible doesn't support the concept of evidence and the appeal to evidence as a valid epistemological tool. And I don't know how any atheist could actually make the case that the Bible has no interest in weighing evidence and then being able to draw conclusions about historical events from the evidence for them. So as a principle, evidence is absolutely, it's the Bible is dripping with that principle. And I would like to see how an atheist would actually be able to deny that. So I'll try to catch that recording when you post it, and that'll
Awesome.
be good.
No spoilers, but yeah, it was a good combo for sure.
Okay. Yep. No spoilers. All right. Well, here's Ming the Merciless signing off. And I appreciate everybody who's come on. I appreciate you, Dale. You're always a great guy to talk with. And I say this all the time, so I'm probably going to sound like a broken record here, but I learn something every time I talk to you, Dale. And I appreciate that, and I value our friendship because of that. So you make such a great contribution to all these dialogues. And so I always look forward to having you on, and I appreciate it, and I thank you for that. Thank you for everybody who was in the chat. Thank you for everyone who's listening. And I'll sign off with Paul Clark's sign off. He has a sign off that says, "Sharpen your axe," because we have a battle to fight. And so everybody sharpen your axe and be well, and we will talk to you next time.